In 2025, King of the Hill returned with one of the strongest and most triumphant revivals of all time. Probably the best animated revival I've ever seen. Season 14 successfully brought back the characters we love while propelling them forward in their lives in compelling and believable ways. Since we're now approaching the second revival season of King of the Hill, Season 15, I figured what better time to compile all of my Season 14 breakdowns into one big accessible refresher video. If you haven't seen any of these, enjoy about 2 hours of King of the Hill Season 14 analysis, and if you have seen them, enjoy a 2-hour refresher before Season 15. Return of the King indeed, folks. King of the Hill Season 14 is finally here, a mere 16 years after To Sirloin with Love aired on Fox. I presume that all of you have binged the entire season already, as it's our first ever binge release for King of the Hill, but my plan is actually to go through these episodes one by one with these video breakdowns, of course starting with the Season 14 premiere, Return of the King. And there is lots to go over since this one is more or less a pilot for this new aged up version of the show, so let's dive into it. Alright, I cannot believe we're talking about new King of the Hill in 2025, but there's a ton to go over here in this premiere. This episode basically has the tallest task of the bunch. It has to not only reintroduce us to these characters all these years later, but establish where they are in their lives, where they've been over the past 8 years, and also present us with the new premise/hook for the series. It's arguably harder than a typical pilot because the viewer isn't going in with as blank a slate, and there's a longer list of characters and aspects of the revival to address than if they were just presenting us with a whole new series. And I do think you can feel a bit of the strain to achieve all of this in one episode. It kind of feels like the reacquainting has to take priority over the story here, and I do think that they accomplished that reacquainting. But at first, I felt like the story and dilemma was maybe a tad undercooked since it had to take a back seat, though I may have come around on it. Let's talk about it. I really loved how most of this episode played out, even if I initially felt like the dilemma and resolution finished a little abruptly. The episode starts with Hank trying to pee on his flight back to Texas and struggling immensely.
Initial descent into Dallas-Fort Worth.
Occupied!
This was always such a funny delivery, which we heard back in Season 3 when Hank had to get a sperm sample for the fertility doctor.
Busy! Occupied! Occupied!
This season has quite a few callbacks overall, and while some maybe feel a little tryhard, I think stuff like this works great. It's just a funny Hank delivery in any context. Some people wouldn't even know it's a callback, and that's why it still works here. I am a little bit on the fence about some of these first jokes from Peggy. Obviously, Peggy oversharing and embarrassing Hank is a big part of the show and a great source of comedy. But man, the level of oversharing about Hank's urethra to a plane full of strangers maybe felt a tad excessive.
The doctors say he now has the urethra of a 7-month-old.
But this is partially because this scene is a little bit expository, with Peggy using the oversharing as an opportunity to catch the audience up to speed with where they've been. But the episode does do a great job pretty immediately setting up the series dilemma. Hank is obviously so ecstatic to be back in Texas, but the episode immediately starts showcasing Hank's confusion with all of the changes that have occurred in his absence, starting with how the Dallas-Fort Worth airport now looks like a shopping mall.
What? Are we still in Amsterdam?
And this is basically the crux of Hank's issue in this episode. The full-on culture shock after missing out on the previous 8 years of change while living in the more insulated, frozen-in-time company town at the Aramco base. Every single thing is a bit of a struggle for Hank. He has no idea what boba is, he doesn't really understand how Uber works, he tries to give the driver his ID, he has absolutely no idea which bathroom he's supposed to use in the restaurant, he is shocked that his friend who stayed at his house would leave him information about solar panels.
Solar panels? What other religious propaganda did they leave?
And yeah, it can kind of feel like this episode is just running down a checklist of modern issues for Hank to be upset about, but that's the point. These are all things that the people in Arlen are just used to by now. But Hank missed these changes over the last 8 years, and he's being confronted by them all at once. It is simply meant to be a bombardment of change for Hank. They do a good job establishing the new status quo here, which more or less is the old status quo, but with the added caveat that now Hank is even less familiar with some of the more drastic changes in modern society. And I think what's most important about this setup is just how thoroughly it stands to push Hank out of his comfort zone. Previously, the environment in Arlen was more or less in support of his worldview, and often the drama and conflict stemmed from other people or ideas sort of entering or infiltrating into Hank's space and world. And yeah, he would often learn something from those experiences, but here, the place that was previously Hank's safe space, that fostered his worldview, is itself throwing him curveballs left and right. I also love that they showcase that Hank's issues are less anger over ideology and more, I find this inconvenient and confusing. Hank's mostly just annoyed by all gender restrooms because he has no idea which one he's supposed to use. It's a world he thought he understood, but now he doesn't even know where to pee. Even just the town's new infrastructure, the bike lanes, the lane dividers, the traffic signs, they completely mess up his commute home and prevent him turning into the alley that he's turned into every day for most of his life.
That's an extra mile of driving anytime we come home from anywhere to the south. Green my ass.
And it's not just the world that's changed in those 8 years, but also Hank has to come to the realization that his friends have gone through changes as well. And I think the show does a great job not changing these characters fundamentally, but still allowing them to have gone through changes in their lives. Dale is still Dale, but since Hank left, he briefly became mayor, though briefly is absolutely the key word here. But it showcases that while previously Dale's beliefs were super fringe, and he was kind of just this outlier, kooky friend, at least some of the world has started conforming to his type of belief system, even if he technically only won 9% of the vote. During the pandemic, Boomhauer actually got into a serious relationship and now basically has a stepson, though we actually never see his girlfriend in the body of the show, and in the intro sequence where we do see her, she's wearing these huge aviator sunglasses and a massive mask. It makes me wonder if the joke is just going to be that we never see her, which is kind of a funny gimmick. Pair someone you never see with a character you can never understand. But Boomhauer doesn't feel like a different character. Yeah, he's not a ladies' man anymore, but now we just get to see him in this new period of his life, full-on dad mode. I also gotta give them credit for the incredible fake out with Nancy and John Redcorn, or at least what I think is a fake out. A lot of people were obviously really worried based on the new intro sequence that Nancy and John Redcorn had gotten back together, even after she broke it off with him in the original series. But it seems as though they're really just working together professionally as co-hosts slash real estate agents hosting the show Selling Arlen.
It was Dale's idea.
Again, a really fun subversion, an interesting way to keep Nancy and John Redcorn in each other's lives without continuing the affair. And then there's Bill, and honestly, Bill's trajectory here sadly makes a little too much sense. Post Hank and Peggy leaving and through the pandemic, Bill has gone into recluse overdrive. Probably the least surprising reveal of the entire revival, to be honest. But I think that even when this trajectory makes so much sense for Bill, being confronted by this jarring change is a lot for Hank to handle. This episode obviously has to do a lot of table setting for the new series, and though it does feel to me like the sort of reacquainting slash catch-up supersedes the story at hand, I actually think they do a pretty great job incorporating that catch-up into Hank and Peggy's little arc in this one. Showcasing all of their friends in these new places in life are just more brands of change that make them uncomfortable and less stable with their life in Arlen. They anticipated returning to their home and safe space, only to find that in many ways, Arlen had continued moving forward without them. And the episode explains why this is even more jarring for them by showcasing exactly what Hank and Peggy's lives are like working in propane on the Aramco base in Saudi Arabia. As the creators spelled out in interviews, these bases are these little Americanized company towns. They're sheltered, insulated, and basically just look like your classic white picket fence American dream suburb. They are far more frozen in time than Arlen itself, and Hank and Peggy were able to fully engulf themselves in the exact lifestyle they were used to back in Arlen, but with Arlen having moved on, now they're the ones who have to catch up, and their entire journey in this episode is about recognizing what is actually important to them. But before we explain how this all wraps up, let's talk about Bobby. Bobby's side of this new series is really where the show gets to spread its wings into new territory, and also explore the character growth that I think the fans will be most eager to see. Obviously, Hank and Peggy are in a new stage in life, but their new stage is not as drastically different as Bobby's, and it is undoubtedly more exciting to see the trajectory of a character who who previously we only knew as a kid or teenager. And I think they've chosen a really interesting life path for Bobby here. Obviously, back in the original series, Bobby showed a real interest in two major things: comedy and food. His initial goal was to become a prop comic and pursue comedy, but later in the show, he found that he had a major talent for cooking in numerous different ways. I think having Bobby be the chef at a Robata restaurant is a pretty cool middle ground here. We basically see that he has to entertain and host using the charm and charisma from his comedy chops while also preparing delicious and unique meals with his cooking chops. I also think having Bobby forgo college to run this restaurant puts him in a really unique position. The show could have easily turned into a college set comedy for half of the runtime, but instead we get a great mix of workplace sitcom and young adult dilemmas for Bobby, Joseph, and Connie, plus a little bit of that college stuff for good measure. One other little detail that I particularly loved was how they sort of subtly put Bobby in a really similar work situation as Hank had back in the original series. Obviously back then, Hank was the perpetual assistant manager of Strickland. He was the glue that kept the company together, he did most of the important work, but he was never quite given the credit he deserved. In the revival, we learn that Bobby is the one running Robata Chain, and that his quote-unquote partner, Chain Wasanasong, is really only the money man. He doesn't do any actual work, despite his name being on the business. And Bobby, in turn, is a bit of an overwhelmed workaholic. Like Hank before him, Bobby is the engine that keeps the business running, despite that business bearing the name of a less deserving man. Honestly, pretty ingenious. It's a very similar scenario without being too on-the-nose identical. It allows for similar themes and messages without outright repeating stories, and through his new life experience, it can allow Bobby to appreciate what his dad has already gone through. There's a lot of potential here. Bobby's work-focused life does mean that he has a bit less time for socializing, but I like that they immediately show he's still capable of having a social life. One of the first things we see Bobby do is impress and entertain a group of college kids at his restaurant, and I think the show was really smart to maintain that Bobby's wit, charm, charisma, and general social aptitude shines through to adulthood. He really hits it off with these kids, and they even invite him to a frat party where he further impresses everyone with his cooking and social skills.
I'm going. Come join. You're like really cool.
Okay. I maybe just will.
I genuinely love Bobby's delivery here. He's so smooth. He really is charming. And I love that the writers just immediately show Bobby is still good with women, something that was abundantly clear in the original series, as he had numerous girls show mutual interest in him. But I love that they didn't shy away from the idea that Bobby would absolutely get around in young adulthood. But they also make sure to seed that while Bobby is good with women, he's also maybe looking for something more than that. After his hookup, he probes interest in hanging out some more, and she basically just says, no, this was a one-time thing. And Bobby plays it cool, to his credit. I really like young adult Bobby. This leads to his reunion with Connie, and I guess if I had any real nitpick about this repilot, it is a tiny bit convenient and coincidental that Hank and Peggy's return to Texas perfectly coincides with Bobby reconnecting with Connie for the first time in years. We're made to understand that Bobby has been back in Texas for a while longer than Hank or Peggy, and to me, it's a bit surprising that he didn't look up or reconnect with Connie of his own volition, particularly when he is apparently roommates with Joseph. I feel like there would have at least been some probing, but again, this is a nitpick. I do think we know why Connie didn't reach out to Bobby, despite knowing about his restaurant. She hints that she was seeing her friend on campus, and based on the fact that we learn who this friend is later, I think it tracks that she might feel weird about reconnecting with Bobby through that friend. I'm trying to keep spoilers to the individual episodes I'm talking about, despite knowing you all probably binged this already, but I'll keep it at that. I think besides the arc that Hank and Peggy go on in this episode, the other thing it does really well is basically set the stage for the more serialized elements we see in Bobby's story. Basically, anything in Bobby's life that's career or romance based. This is one of the reasons I think this revival really excels. It doesn't shy away from giving us an ongoing story with progression through Bobby's young adulthood, while it really focuses on episodic conundrums for Hank in his new place in life on the other side of things. The show slightly adapts to modern television storytelling without removing the charm of the original episodic format. It's having its cake and eating it too, really. Okay. Now let's talk about how this episode all wraps up in terms of the emotional arc. I actually really like how much their return to Arlen challenged Hank and Peggy. This coat of new paint over everything made it all feel so unfamiliar.
Look at all these reflectors. And what kind of food is poke?
Hank seeing the Oklahoma-style barbecue joint being the last straw was a really funny touch, but I think the way this all comes together in these final couple of scenes is really sweet. Basically, their return experience sort of instantly put Hank and Peggy in a place of cynicism towards what was once their home, to the point where they are fully ready to go back to their cushy lives on the Aramco base in Saudi Arabia. And you can see as they approach the Megalomart that they're doing so with these cynical attitudes. Hank presumes that these Girl Scout cookies are gluten-free and are going to be bad, but they quickly realize that these are just some sweet little girls selling regular Girl Scout cookies. They're trying to raise money. I love this exchange about the Samoas. The Girl Scout cookies Hank likes are called Samoas, but the Girl Scouts tell them that they're actually called Caramel Delights now, just to be considerate of Samoan people. And I think this is really clever, because basically Hank still has his favorite cookies. They just have a slightly new name. It tells him that though there might be a new title and label, what's in the box is still exactly the same.
That's a good change.
And this is a perfect metaphor for what Hank has to learn here. Sure, the box that contains Arlen might look a little different, but the cookies on the inside of it, the people, the substance, they're still here, and they are always what made Arlen home for Hank and Peggy. And would you believe me if I told you this also works as an additional metaphor for the viewer at home? Though there might be a bit of a new look and new hook to this version of King of the Hill, the characters, the themes, the messages, they're still what they've always been. They might not be called Samoas, but they taste the same. I kinda wish this scene had maybe lingered a tiny bit longer, but it's still really lovely. Hank strikes up a conversation with a contractor over his Sawzall. He realizes that the community is still here, and of course, they remember why they can never leave Texas. And the final scene kinda shows Hank putting this belief into action. He gets his new grill up and running, and he has the neighbors over for food. Bobby comes to cook with him, and it even lures Bill out of his house finally, showing that Hank himself can actually act as an important pillar of this community. And Hank cooking and the entire neighborhood coming out to eat with him is really similar to the way the original show ended into Sirloin with Love all those years ago. And this episode ends with the first full playthrough of that brand new title sequence featuring that perfect old theme song. A great way to say the king has returned and he's here to stay. Honestly, while I did initially think you could really feel the strain in this first episode with how much it had to balance, the more I think about it, the more impressed I am with how well it set everything up, and particularly with how well they handled that little crisis of faith for Hank and Peggy. It's a really impressive return for the show, and I think the season mostly just gets better from here. So if you're gonna come along for the ride, I should have a video for season 14 episode 2, The Beer Story, up very soon. It might be tomorrow, it might be the day after, and the plan is to cover Bobby Gets Grilled shortly after that. Hopefully that means I'll have all 10 episodes covered in depth over the next couple of weeks. I'm really excited to dive into all of these. I think there is just so much to talk about, and also still so much they can do with this new series premise moving forward. There's just so much potential, and at the end of the day, it's still King of the Hill. King of the Hill Season 14 followed up its very strong but stuffed repilot with a smart story decision, a Hank and Bobby episode. Going into the season, this was the one that I was maybe most looking forward to. Beer opinions just provide a lot of potential for both generational divide and father-son connection. And I'm happy to say that to that end, it delivered, and in ways I didn't really expect. A really great father-son story that primarily showcases just how similar Hank and Bobby actually are, despite their opinionated differences. This also has one of my favorite subplots in the entire season, and it really latches onto those same themes perfectly, so let's dive into it. So obviously one of the most important aspects of King of the Hill has always been Hank and Bobby's struggle to connect. A more repressed and traditional man who has a hard time understanding his more hard-on-his-sleeve type son. And so many of the best episodes of the show are them finding common ground despite their generational divide. But often that comes through Hank or Bobby coming around on something they previously didn't didn't quite understand, discovering some kind of value or integrity in something that they had rejected that the other person had embraced. But now that Bobby is a young adult, the revival does something really smart. They focus an episode on a subject that both Hank and Bobby have interest in, but that they both approach from very different perspectives because of that aforementioned generational divide, and that interest is beer. Yes, one of Hank's special interests is beer, and of course propane. The episode opens with Hank waking up super early despite being retired, and not really knowing what to do with his time. Essentially, this is the new hook for Hank in this entire revival season.
The thing they don't tell you about retirement is there's so much time to fill.
The way Hank starts spending his day features some pretty great gags that bring modern updates to some of the older King of the Hill staples. Hank is watching a reboot/sequel of Monsignor Martinez, and this leads to one of my favorite Peggy Spanish faux pas in maybe the entire series, when she tells Hank that Martinez just said next time he's going to kill their whole family.
Peggy, it's subtitled. He's wishing those orphans Merry Christmas.
There's also our first look inside the modern Megalomart, complete with lazy young employees, which isn't anything new. That was actually pretty standard for the Megalomart throughout the entire original series as well, but I do like the added detail that now not only do they not know where anything is, but the only way they can tell if they even have anything in stock is by looking it up online. It's just a different modern brand of useless. But Hank spots a homebrew kit at Megalomart, which sets the entire episode in motion. Just a great idea that I'm almost surprised they didn't do in the original run ever.
Puts together my two loves, beer and propane.
I think they were also smart to immediately drop an episode that showcases not just that Bobby is an adult now, but showcases his skills and know-how related to his field, and that be a field that Hank has at least some layman's interest in. It's sort of a perfect way to establish more of Bobby's professionalism, but also to challenge Hank, who has to come to terms with the fact that his son might actually know more than he does about something he's interested in. It makes for a great first conflict between Bobby and Hank since he's returned to Arlen. It was also just smart to have an episode where Bobby and Hank's stories fully intertwine after that first revival episode has them pretty separate in establishing the new status quo. I also love that Peggy is the one who tries to push Hank and Bobby together on the beer brewing front. That's always been a major aspect of the original series, Peggy attempting to facilitate Hank and Bobby's connection. I think they handle Bobby's dialogue here really well too. He's obviously so knowledgeable when it comes to beer brewing, but he also comes across as pretty condescending.
My beer has hops.
Yep, it sure does, Dad. All beer has hops.
But I think this really just stems from Bobby really wanting to prove himself to his dad through something that he really is actually good at. But Bobby and Hank obviously have completely different philosophies when it comes to beer, and this is such a great real-world generational conflict to explore. Hank drinks Alamo and only Alamo, and so of course he wants to brew a beer that is like Alamo. But Bobby is obviously more into the craft beer scene and appreciates the variety beer can offer. And he has a distaste for Hank's quote-unquote boring alley beer. I've said this like 4 times, but I think this is a really smart conflict because rather than one of them meeting the other on their playing field, they're meeting in a fully common space, and their friction isn't that they love beer, it's in how they love beer. But the true genius of this episode is that once they go their separate ways and brew their own beers, the episode basically showcases how undeniably alike Bobby and Hank actually are. Not in their subjective taste when it comes to beer, but in their commitment to an obsession with the craft, despite the fact that they're using that craft to pursue different outcomes. We get these parallel focus groups where Hank gets the gang's thoughts on his brew, and Bobby gets Joseph, Chain, and Chain's lackey's thoughts on his. And both of them ultimately end up fully succumbing to peer pressure, moving away from their original visions for their beer. I have got to shout out how much I loved this montage showcasing Hank and Bobby's parallel work ethic in beer brewing, set to Runnin' Down a Dream by Tom Petty. Honestly, I hope they spend the money to license more Tom Petty music across the entire revival, as you know, like an ongoing tribute to Tom and to Lucky, of course. One of my favorite details in the montage is that both Hank and Bobby are up late reading about brewing to prepare, and these corresponding shots look so good, but you can see that Bobby is reading The Art of the Brew, and Hank is reading Brew Math. Kind of a perfect way to showcase that the pair have the exact same work ethic, but Bobby approaches from a more left-brained perspective, and Hank from a more right-brained one. But I really like the way that this this episode doesn't really frame Bobby or Hank as having a better or more correct take. Even though Bobby is clearly more experienced in the brewing field, they're both equally as passionate about their own taste in beer. Bobby and Joseph just aren't fans of more boring classic beers, and Hank thinks that craft beers are doing entirely too much.
Is Cursed Hobbit Stout supposed to taste like medicine?
And this all culminates in a really sweet ending, but before we get to that resolution, let's talk about the subplots in this one. One of which was sort of just a goofy comedic side adventure for Boomhauer, who is sort of lamenting the way the times have changed and reminisces about how he tried his first beer when he was really young thanks to his dad, so he opts to get some non-alcoholic beer for Luke Jr. This whole story is obviously not particularly substantial, but it does have some really funny moments, and it does kind of tie to the themes of the episode. Luke Jr. crushing a near beer on his head was very slapstick, super funny, and I really liked the idea that he was just having his friends over to the alley to drink non-alcoholic beer, just like Hank and the boys do. And I really loved this little moment from when it all wrapped up.
Stop right now, man. I would have cut you off.
No idea what you said, but I just wanted to be cool like you, Boomhauer.
That's pretty sweet. I like Dad Hauer, or Boomfather. It's just nice that even in these fully comedic subplots, the show is aiming for these nice sentimental moments, and it shows Boomhauer in a dynamic we haven't seen much of before. Plus, the way it ties to the themes of the other two stories in the episode is pretty cool, and the other subplot might actually be my favorite of the entire season. While working out their brews for the competition, Dale suggests he might be able to eliminate a certain competitor.
Are you suggesting killing Bobby?
He lands on fixing the competition via sabotage, and at the exact same time, Joseph decides to do the same thing for Bobby.
You work on the beer, I'll take care of the rest.
This is really such a tiny part of the episode, but it makes such an impact, showcasing that Joseph is truly Dale's son in the funniest way imaginable. They even make sure to show both of them giving Hank and Bobby these winks alluding to their sabotage plans, like father, like son. And while Dale is scoping out the judge's house, it turns out Joseph is doing the exact same thing. I cannot even explain how much joy it brought me to see Dale and Joseph just sharing a cigarette here.
Did you already look through his garbage for compromat? That's why I couldn't find any compromat.
I really do think this is one of the best things the entire revival has done. Years ago, I made this video about Joseph and his relationship to both Dale and John Redcorn, which was a really interesting subject to explore, particularly as potential father figures. And obviously, the show goes out of its way to showcase that Dale is mostly a really great father to Joseph. That's like the crux of the episode Peggy's Headache, when she discovers the truth about Joseph and considers telling Dale.
Can't watch Encino Man without milk balls, huh?
Thanks, Dad!
But the show does also showcase a lot of instances where Dale's more neurotic tendencies actually led to neglect or put Joseph in danger, and we've even seen John Redcorn step in and help in some cases. I always liked the idea that the show was sort of pushing the nature versus nurture narrative. The whole John Redcorn may be your father, but he's not your daddy type shtick. But outside of just showing that Dale can be a good and loving father, I always felt like the show could have done a better job showcasing Dale's actual impact on Joseph as a person, to really hammer home those explorations of nature versus nurture. And that's why I think this revival subplot just hits so hard for me. We see that in his young adulthood, despite looking more and more like John Redcorn every day, Joseph is so much like Dale. I mean, this shot of Joseph taking a trash bag out of his pocket and jumping into it, rolling up to hide himself, is maybe the most Pocket Sand-esque thing we've seen in the show outside of Pocket Sand itself. And I love the way this culminates in both of them bailing on the competition in paranoia the moment they see a couple of cops. It's perfect. Like, this is only 2 scenes long, but it went such a long way for me. And this story about Dale and Joseph, alongside the sillier story about Luke Jr. wanting to be more like Boomhauer, ties really brilliantly to Hank and Bobby's story on a thematic level. It's all about the impacts fathers have on their kids and the ways their tendencies can be passed down, even if they have incredibly different tastes or worldviews. I love the way this episode both highlights the intense differences and intense similarities between Hank and Bobby. They are both so unbelievably passionate and unbelievably stubborn about their own tastes. And in this one, both Hank and Bobby learn a lesson, that they should have put their stubborn, overly competitive feelings aside and just allowed each other to have differing opinions about beer.
But the sad part is, it could have been time spent doing something fun with my son. and I didn't give it a chance.
And in an episode where Bobby spends the entire runtime trying to prove himself in the ways that set him apart from his dad, he actually ends up proving himself in the ways that make him a lot like his dad.
Different beer, but the hops fell out of the same tree.
Man, I really love that line, particularly after Bobby gave Hank such a hard time about the hops comment earlier in the episode. And I think maybe best of all, though in the end they do come together, they don't come around on each other's style of beer.
Still boring.
Too fruity.
I think it's pretty refreshing that the resolution here isn't either of them being wrong about how they feel about beer. It's about both of them admitting that they were approaching this whole scenario the wrong way. And like many King of the Hill episodes, about learning what's most important to them. It's not winning a competition to prove that their opinion is the correct one. It's about sharing a beer with your dad or son and bonding over a shared interest. In addition to just having another quality sentimental King of the Hill resolution, this episode does a lot to sort of build out the new cast of characters and world of the show, in ways I loved and others I was maybe a little more middling on. For one, this is a great Peggy episode, even though she's just a supporting player. Obviously, the way she pushes Hank and Bobby together is very important, but her little through line about demanding the beer be called Peggy Ale was very funny.
Wasanasang Ale.
Are you kidding me?
The show has started implementing a few bleeped curses like this throughout the season, obviously a change from the original run, and while I think they mostly do a good job in selecting what characters and scenarios that these work in, I think that this delivery from Peggy in this episode is far and away the funniest one. I also think this season pretty immediately starts Peggy off in a place where she's really firing on all cylinders. She feels like the Peggy we know and love from like seasons 5 through 8. She's maybe a tad flanderized in her overconfident narcissism compared to seasons 1 through 4, but in a way that is incredibly funny and doesn't feel over the top. It could have been really easy to make Peggy feel like even more of a caricature, and I think the revival did a great job with her right off the bat. Something that this episode really highlighted for me was Bobby's lack of a support structure, at least from friends. Obviously he's got Joseph, and has only just reconnected with Connie in the premiere, but his focus group is made up of Chain and Chain's frat boys, and I did mostly just find the frat boys super annoying, though that also maybe seemed to be the point. And I do think that Chain being a bit more of a focused supporting character makes for a really interesting dynamic in the show, particularly given the business partner relationship with Bobby. I think Chain growing into a typical frat bro is a supernatural evolution, but he's definitely not somebody that Bobby would normally spend time with, which makes the friction from the difference in their personalities really shine given that they're more or less forced to be together in a lot of scenarios. I hope that beyond season 14, Chain gets more development and maybe even a more empathetic arc. While he is definitely a huge douche, they do hint at the weight of the expectation he feels because of his father's success, and I think it would be kind of cool to add a bit more nuance to his character. But it also has me hoping that the show opts to maybe add more substantial supporting characters to the Bobby side of the series. I definitely miss some of his funnier classmates from Tom Landry Middle School, and on Hank's side, it was nice to see them get Brian Robertson in the mix when initially trying Hank's beer, but given that he recommended the brewing competition, I feel like this would have been a good opportunity to keep him involved throughout the episode. Maybe get him in on the focus group with the other members of the Alley Gang. He seems like a character with a lot of potential, and I just feel like getting him in the mix a bit more frequently could have gone a long way to make him stand out here. This episode also obviously features some of the earliest and most jarring dialogue for Dale, as it seems as though they used both Johnny Hardwick and Toby Huss for the episode. And honestly, while I do understand that people are bothered by this, I also think that they were really between a rock and a hard place. Obviously, Johnny didn't record enough of the dialogue to fill out the entire episode, but they were also sitting on Hardwick's final performances ever given, in his beloved iconic role. While it's clear Johnny was struggling to find Dale's voice again, and the mix and match dialogue with Toby's new performance makes it feel even more off, I think this was the only real resolution that I would have been okay with. I just would rather they use Johnny's dialogue to honor his legacy than redo the entire episode to make it more consistent. And for me, while he obviously doesn't sound exactly the same, I think Toby's performance really comes alive in the back part of the season when he's not trying to match Johnny within the body of an episode. I think he'll really grow into the role as the show goes on. He's just such a good comedic voice actor, and I'm really eager to see how he grows after he gets a few episodes under his belt. I think the most exciting standout for me in this episode was Joseph. His new voice actor, Ty LeClaire, really doesn't miss a beat in terms of performance, and I think he really helped elevate the slightly more neurotic characterization they're bringing to the young adult version of the character. Overall, I think the progression of this season is just really really strong so far. It starts with a sort of pilot 2.0 that sets up our new timeline and where the characters are, and then immediately they tell a Hank and Bobby focused story that not only harkens back to the classic King of the Hill formula, but does so in a way that only this new aged up version of the series could have done. It really highlights why they opted to bring the show back the way that they did. It's a really strong start to season 14. And that is what I've got to say about season 14, episode 2, The Beer Story. King of the Hill season 14 continued its strong start with episode 3, Bobby Gets Grilled, an episode that really showcases Bobby's professional life and forces him to prove himself to business partners, cultural critics, and loved ones. This episode also does some pretty fun tightrope walking with its social commentary in regards to cultural appropriation, and in the most King of the Hill way, the episode heavily centers around propane coming between Hank and his son. And honestly, when it comes down to it, I would say this is one of the most important episodes in the history of Hank and Bobby's relationship. So put away your propane accessories, grab a bag of charcoal, and let's dive in. Okay, so this episode completely hinges on something that a lot of us predicted after learning about Bobby's Robata restaurant, that he isn't using propane. Robata is a Japanese cooking method that traditionally uses charcoal, so it wasn't a particularly big stretch to presume there would be a propane versus charcoal conflict here, and Hank is obviously about as upset as you'd think he'd be. I thought this dialogue here also did a pretty great job giving us some implied backstory from the interim period, with Hank talking about their long conversations on the phone, going over the various propane grill options for the restaurant. Honestly, while even just the King of the Hill layman would know that Bobby using charcoal could be a relationship-ending decision in Hank's eyes, I feel like the implied backstory here makes it even harsher. The pride Hank must have felt advising Bobby on what propane grill to use for his own restaurant, and even doing this from across the world over the phone, this was clearly super important to Hank.
Those were some of the best times we ever spent together.
You can tell that Bobby is pretty ashamed of the dishonesty too, but I also don't know if you can really blame him for being afraid to tell Hank the truth. There's a great episode in the original run where Peggy and Bobby start using charcoal behind Hank's back, and that obviously didn't go over well. Using charcoal instead of propane is like a betrayal to Hank. And this initial conflict sends Hank and Bobby their separate ways for the day, Hank going to the George W. Bush Presidential Library, and Bobby desperately trying to find a new supplier for his special Binchitan charcoal. But this basically turns this episode into a story that ruminates on authenticity, and I think it does that in a shockingly fun and well-balanced way. I wondered if this would be addressed at all, since Bobby is basically just a young white dude from Texas running an authentic Japanese and German fusion restaurant, and obviously a lot of people these days might question whether he should be allowed to do that or not, or whether you can even call that authentic. And I love that this episode approaches the concept of authenticity from so many different angles. When Bobby attempts to buy more Binchitan charcoal, the supplier, Mr. Yoshida, refuses to sell to him because he isn't Japanese. And then when they go to his business to try and convince him, they actually learn that this guy is black and was adopted and raised in Japan. It's immediately challenging the perception of what authenticity looks like. And to further illustrate this point, Bobby brings Chain along to try and convince Yoshida, and as a full-blown Laotian, Chain actually doesn't seem to know anything about Laotian culture.
If there was a Laotian martial art, I use it to kick your ass.
There is a Laotian martial art. It's called Mui Lao.
I think this is a pretty interesting piece of commentary. Again, challenging the perception of authenticity. Chain is 100% Laotian, but he's more familiar with frat culture than Laotian culture. The episode also isn't above exploring authenticity in funnier ways as well, particularly through the Italian restaurant in Bobby's shopping plaza run by Mr. Capitelli. This definitely seems more comedically minded than anything, but it's a pretty great bit. Basically, these Italians are full-on stereotypical caricatures and even attempt to shake down Bobby and exchange leases for a charcoal hookup. But when Bobby calls them out, they're super offended.
Do I look like Tony Soprano to you?
That show is why I canceled my HBO.
I particularly loved this conversation that Bobby had with Joseph and Emilio, which covered these things from a lot of different angles. For one, the very idea of a character like Joseph, who is basically a Native American who thinks he's white.
As a white dude, apparently I can't be Speedy Gonzalez anymore.
Side note, this is explicit confirmation that Bobby knows the truth about Joseph's parentage, which is pretty interesting, and now that Joseph is an adult, I'm really curious if the show is going to ever fully address this through the character. Obviously, the idea here is that he's so much like Dale that he also can't see the obvious truth in front of him, but it's definitely interesting to pointedly use this character in this scenario, somebody who, particularly as we saw in the last episode, fully takes after his very white father, despite his actual ancestral heritage. And bringing up Speedy Gonzalez brings up another very interesting observation.
Speedy Gonzalez racist? He's a hero.
This is something that has been talked about a lot. The fact that so many Latinos love Speedy Gonzalez, despite the fact that he's a stereotype voiced by a white dude. He is a beloved piece of pop culture iconography, and it's definitely not a coincidence that this was broached in the episode that's all about whether or not a white dude should be allowed to cook Japanese food. It's also interesting that they have this Mel Blanc conversation, both heralding him as a genius and pointing out that he was voicing a lot of stereotypical characters. Maybe a not so subtle nod to King of the Hill's own genius voice actor Toby Huss, though I think a lot of King of the Hill fans were missing Toby's con this season. I also just loved this entire conversation from a character perspective, giving us great insight into adult Joseph, developing Emilio as a supporting character more, and also showcasing a great appreciation and understanding for Bobby. Yeah, he's a professional chef now, but he still absolutely geeks out on comedy history any chance he gets. Let's just say I saw a lot of myself in Bobby in this scene. And obviously the last place Bobby gets interrogated about his restaurant is on the German side of things. Man, Bobby Gets Grilled really was the perfect title for this episode. At this point, it really just feels like it's meant to bombard Bobby from every side imaginable. I've also seen a lot of people praise this little callback about Cotton.
He machine gunned my grandfather.
So he was one of the 50 men?
Definitely a very funny delivery, so it gets a pass, but it also felt a little sweaty in setup to me. Like, would this guy really know the identity of the person who killed his grandfather in WW2? They get away with a couple callbacks in the same vein this year. Sweaty setups saved by very funny punchlines. It's also very funny to think about what Cotton might have thought of Bobby running a Japanese-German fusion restaurant, given he claimed he fought in both Europe and the Pacific during the war. Okay, shifting from the ways this episode explores cultural authenticity, let's talk about Hank's journey through the George W. Bush Presidential Library, which I guess more or less confirms who Hank ended up voting for in the episode The Perils of Polling. Hank nearly didn't vote at all because W gave him a limp handshake, but at the very end of the episode he casts a ballot, though the episode never confirmed who he voted for. The way Hank wistfully pines for the days of George W. definitely implies which direction that ballot was cast, though.
So many jobs created with one pen stroke.
I think the subplot was pretty fun and effective within this story, forcing Hank to reckon with the ways some people have shifted to more radical beliefs. And I think a museum was a pretty great setting for that subplot. With history literally at their fingertips, people are often choosing to ignore the truth that's in front of them. And obviously this is explored via Dale. Gotta quickly shout out Hank's frustrations with Dale, leading to one of the funniest things I've ever heard him say.
Nancy is a good Hank.
But though the show is definitely exploring the ways some people have become more Dale-like in their conspiracy-minded attitudes, I also think the episode did a great job showcasing that Dale is still a few steps further into the fringe than most of them.
George Bush's secret twin brother Jub.
It felt like Hank was more or less trying to use the history represented in the museum to center himself in culture that he appreciates and understands, and he'd expect that a museum would be a very controlled environment to present this information. He just didn't anticipate the way the other people might behave in this quote-unquote controlled environment, and the ways Dale sort of took control of the tour and turned it into his own conspiracy lesson was very funny, very Dale. But I really appreciated the whole situation room sequence, where everyone has to take on historical roles, and the ahistorical takes start to invade Hank's fantasy here. It was such a perfect distillation of Hank as a character. This revival did a great job not shifting him too far in any direction, and the ways he sensibly rejects the conspiracy-minded takes while also firmly maintaining his own principles was so well handled. Like when this woman wants to be Obama's Kenyan handler.
Obama was born in Hawaii. That's reason enough not to vote for him without making stuff up.
It was just a really fun way to confront Hank with the changing culture from a slightly different angle, pretty expertly crafted through characters we already know and love. It gave them an opportunity to show that Hank is still Hank Hill, and his convictions are still in place, even though the world around him has shifted, though history does still repeat itself. But I think the struggles Hank faces here in regards to historical accuracy are a pretty effective tie-in to his anger towards Bobby at the end of the episode, but we'll get there. Okay, now seems like a good time to talk about the absolute MVP of new characters, Emilio, played by comedian Anthony Citric Campos. Campos has actually been on King of the Hill before. He played Enrique's brother-in-law in season 9's Irreconcilable Differences, all the way back in 2005.
Hey, are you Enrique's friend, Hank Hill?
But Judge recruited him to play a new, pretty major supporting role for the revival, one of the most substantial new characters joining the cast for sure, appearing in 6 episodes for season 14. And man, I absolutely love this guy. For one, he is absolutely one of the funniest and most likable dudes in the show. His response to Bobby calling Mel Blanc a genius killed me here.
Sounds more like a white guy who stole a lot of jobs from Latinos and farm animals.
But more importantly, Emilio is this foundational presence in Bobby's professional life. While Bobby is obviously skilled, passionate, and inspired to cook his cuisine, he's also very young. And with youth often comes a lot of people telling you how you should be doing things. Bobby is getting that from his business partners, his potential charcoal supplier, a bunch of random Germans, and of course, his own father. Every single person has an opinion about what the right way for him to do things is. And Bobby is forced to prove himself to all of them at the same time. This line kinda sums it up.
How do you pass a test when there's so many different people marking it?
And it's so easy to understand why that would be so overwhelming for Bobby. Despite knowing that his cooking is going to be better if he uses this specific type of charcoal, Hank, the Wasana-songs, and Mr. Yoshida are all basically telling him that he cannot or should not use it. In the Wasana-songs case, for cost effectiveness and simplicity, and for Hank and Mr. Yoshida, completely separate but strong moral convictions. The easiest thing for Bobby to do here would be to just use propane, to give in, to make everybody happy, and he considers it. But despite being Bobby's sous chef, Emilio basically acts as a mentor figure to Bobby. He's been around the block, he's a restaurant veteran, and he knows that the most important thing Bobby has that will keep his business afloat is integrity.
And all of them went under because they didn't do their homework and were trying too hard to please everyone else. You're a great chef, Bobby.
Man, not only do I just love this sentiment, but this delivery. While I mentioned in my last video that I'd love to see Bobby's friend group expand a bit, Emilio is the vital support pillar in his professional life. Somebody with a bit more experience and perspective to help guide Bobby's raw talent and passion, and see through all the bureaucracy he's got to deal with. Honestly, after I finish all these episode breakdowns, or maybe after next season, I might make an Emilio video. He's a top tier addition to the cast. But Emilio reaffirming Bobby's belief in his own integrity was such a highlight and such a brilliant lead into the resolution here. Because ultimately, I think the message is that the thing that supersedes all of these questions of authenticity is the reality of Bobby's integrity. There are all kinds of inauthentic business endeavors that are simply trend chasing, trying to strike when the iron's hot and capitalize on other people's ideas, innovations, cultures, food, etc. Mr. Yoshida and the Germans maybe had a point when they were worried about the authenticity of Bobby's Robata restaurant. It's not a bad thing to be worried about inauthentic representations of their culture. But while Bobby might not be German or Japanese, he has an authentic love, appreciation, and understanding of those cuisines, and he was attempting to bring those cuisines to life in authentic ways. There is a genuine integrity behind his inspirations and motivations, and the fact that this shines through in his cooking is exactly what convinces them that he is somebody who treats their cultures with respect and admiration. And I think this is why this was such a perfect way to actually bring Hank around on Bobby's decision here. Hank has always been a character who first and foremost respects integrity. Hank's nightmarish experience at the George W. Bush Presidential Library highlighted that historical accuracy and integrity go hand in hand.
Recent events have made me understand why you value historical accuracy and authenticity.
And despite having firm personal beliefs about propane, Bobby's firm personal beliefs about providing an authentic Robata experience highlight his integrity. And man, I really loved this affirming line from Hank.
Everyone loves the food. and that includes me.
Getting Hank to say he loves food that was cooked with charcoal has got to be the absolute highlight of Bobby's relationship with his father up till this point. To me, this goes hand in hand with the original pilot's "Damn it, you're my boy" line and the original finale's handshake as quintessential Hank and Bobby moments. Even if Hank did have to headcanon some Rabada lore a little bit to make it work for him.
Propane wasn't available in the 17th century, right? So maybe the inventors of Rabada would have made that choice if only it had been available back then.
A pretty incredible cope from Hank, and a sweet moment that Bobby lets him have. Damn, these episodes are seriously just hitting it out of the park with these sweet and sentimental endings. I said it in the other breakdowns, but it's so relieving that the show's biggest moments and messages aren't at all rooted in cynicism and instead embrace the connection and relationships between these characters.
I'd like to make a toast to the chef. To Bobby Hill.
To me, this was a super vital moment in Hank and Bobby's relationship, especially as adults. Obviously, we're gonna still see generational friction between them. That's the whole crux of the show. But I cannot believe they were able to spin a compelling narrative that actually made me believe that Hank would come around to the idea of Bobby using charcoal in his restaurant. But further, it shows that despite his stubbornness, Hank has grown to trust Bobby's integrity. King of the Hill is often centered on Hank's stubbornness, blinding him to the underlying integrity in things he fails to understand. And this is just a pitch-perfect example of that formula. Between this emotional story between our main characters, the great showcase of Hank reconciling with new aspects of modern culture, the very funny, multifaceted approach to the idea of authenticity, and the proper coming out episode for probably the best new character in the show, Bobby Gets Grilled might be my favorite episode of the entire revival. And it might not surprise you to learn that it was co-written by a King of the Hill veteran, Norm Hiscock, responsible for a whole slew of classic episodes. Propane Boom, and They Call It Bobby Love, To Kill a Ladybird, Bobby Goes Nuts, The Bluegrass Is Always Greener. Truly some of the best the show has to offer. Overall, I think the 1-2-3 punch of these first 3 episodes goes such a long way to re-establish this series and showcase that the current crew really has a great handle on the most important aspects of King of the Hill. While there are maybe a few growing pains in establishing the new time period and shifting the focus between Arlen and Dallas, the most important aspects of the series shine through, confidently building a new status quo out of their tried and true formulas. And that is all I've got for season 14, episode 3, Bobby Gets Grilled. King of the Hill's revival continued its strong streak with season 14, episode 4, Chore Money, Chore Problems. An episode that continues to explore Hank's struggles to adapt to post-retirement life and gives us the first real steps into Bobby and Connie's adult friendship. This is one that feels like a real classic premise on Hank's side of things and an interesting look at modern dating and friendships on Bobby's side of things, culminating in some of my favorite heartstring-pulling moments of the entire season. So let's dive in. Chore Money, Chore Problems opens with Hank once again struggling to find ways to fill his newly wide open schedule. As you might expect, he's basically knocked out every chore around his own house that you could imagine.
I shaved 0.4 seconds off the sink's drain time.
And this episode is a pretty strong follow-up to The Beer Story in regards to Hank navigating post-retirement life. Obviously, in that episode, Hank found a specific hobby to fill his newfound free time, and in this one, he decides to tag along with Boomhauer, who's taken to a TaskRabbit-like app called Chore Chimp. Basically an app for handymen to get hired for tasks around town.
It's heaven on earth.
Though I gotta call out that the Chore Chimp app's icon is clearly a monkey, not a chimp or any type of ape. But we'll give it a pass, this isn't CinemaSins. Honestly, as far as Hank's story goes, I think this episode sort of strikes a perfect balance of old and new. I love the way Hank is forced to explore things he probably wouldn't have considered previously, and the ways those things ultimately challenge his perception or push him out of his comfort zone, even when the things he chooses feel right up his alley. It makes so much sense that Hank would not just be interested in, but excited to do handyman work for other people. In a way, this is kind of his love language. In the premiere, he fondly dreamed about checking Bobby's tire pressure for his reunion with him, and this was how he imagined their first reunion in years. He's such a practical guy, and one who has a lot of repression and discomfort when it comes to emotional vulnerability. He's always struggled with being open about anything involving his personal life.
Your father has kissed me.
Peggy!
So while Hank does a pitch-perfect job at all of the handyman tasks he's given, Boomhauer is the one who handles the customer service side of things.
Man, love, it's like a dang old battlefield.
So, because Hank is incredibly utilitarian, to him, doing a great job on a task assigned is more than enough. He doesn't realize the personability that often comes with this kind of one-on-one customer service. And after Boomhauer gets a concussion and Hank takes over his chore chimping entirely, he starts to understand that there's more to the job than just the chores. This is genuinely such a perfect Hank Hill dilemma. One of Hank's favorite things in the world, helping people through efficient, well-executed handiwork, being combined with one of his least favorite things in the world, emotional vulnerability.
Plus, Lena and I haven't had sex in I don't know how long.
Outside of the obviously more modern vehicle that brings this plot to us, the TaskRabbit-like app, this absolutely feels like the type of story you would have seen in the original run of King of the Hill. A genuine interest of Hank's being invaded by something that he truly struggles to cope with. And the app is a perfect delivery system for Hank to actually be forced to reconcile with this reality, because he literally gets a score for it, only 2 bananas. I think this episode also did a great job having Peggy be the one to help center Hank and help him understand the issue here. While I think it's easy to look at Peggy's lines and tendencies in season 14, such as "I've been told my whole life I'm a 5" or the incredibly overconfident Arabic and Spanish, and think that they've maybe maintained a bit too much of her Flanderization, I feel like they've actually found a pretty good balance.
They just wanted a kind ear and some advice.
This episode in particular, while she is more of a supporting player, she does play a vital role in Hank's journey. Yes, she's obsessed with a British reality show the entire episode, but Peggy is a bit more sensible when it comes to other people, at least when it's a little less directly relating to herself, I'll say. There are definitely episodes in the original run where Peggy's entitled nature led her to fail empathy checks and do selfish things. But in this instance, she's fully able to help Hank face the harsh reality that while he absolutely did a great job, the chore chimp task wasn't all the job required.
I'm sorry I'm not Mr. Personality like Boomhauer.
This is also a pretty funny thing to bring up after the Uber joke we saw back in the season 14 premiere, where Hank gives his Uber driver 4 stars so he had something to work towards. It's funny to see Hank immediately grapple with a new perspective, and this personal experience helping him understand that he might have been wrong.
If you ask me, 5s should be rare in this world. I deserve all 5 bananas.
We love a little growth, and I really loved that Hank's growth in this episode was twofold. He goes back to the couple, and while he did change his behavior here, he initially just sucked it up and allowed himself to share some things that he would have otherwise found uncomfortable about his personal life. He shares a story about how Bobby wouldn't latch on to Peggy after he was born, and this helped the young couple feel seen and heard. But that young couple also ran a YouTube channel and fully put Hank's story on blast in their new video.
Hank shared that Peggy had trouble breastfeeding.
God, this has gotta be one of my favorite Hank bois in the entire series. I'm obsessed with the animation of him throwing the phone. I gotta start memeing this. But what I love about this sort of additional turn in the narrative here is that it basically forces Hank to be more open with his wife. Peggy isn't actually upset that Hank shared her personal story with the neighbors. She's upset that he still struggles to share his own struggles with anybody, particularly her. And it still takes Hank a while to really figure this out. He initially just tries to share an embarrassing story about staple gunning Bobby's diaper when he was a baby, not understanding that this isn't the kind of openness he needs to bring into his life, and that Peggy is actually just genuinely concerned for Hank and can tell he's been struggling more than he lets on.
I'm sure you'd just love me to tell you how scared I am that I'll never feel satisfied unless I'm working.
They do such a great job with the dialogue here. Hank does open up, but he frames it as the things he's not supposed to say, the things that he won't say, even though he is just fully saying it.
I'm from a different generation. We keep that stuff inside.
That is so quintessentially Hank Hill. Obviously, this repressed, reserved inability to open up ultimately stems from how he was raised. This is a core aspect of the character laid out all the way back in the original pilot.
You know how I was raised? What my father's like?
I got my shins blown off by a Japan man's machine gun, so don't come crying to me with your problem.
And Peggy getting Hank to actually open up about his feelings in this new era of his life really nicely ties to Hank's journey in that original pilot, when he had to open up and tell Bobby that he loved him. I think this revival season is doing a really great job giving us these parallels to major stories and core pillars of the original run. And I especially love that even though Peggy was more of a supporting player here, they even tie her little story that was playing in the background to Hank's struggle. struggles, admitting that she also has no idea what to do in retirement, and that's manifested as obsessively binging TV shows. Honestly, I was really impressed that they managed to make Peggy a sort of unsung hero in this one, despite her playing this background role. And I think the line that really cements Peggy's importance here was from Hank, while he was giving that young couple advice, which genuinely might be one of my favorite Hank/Peggy moments in the entire series.
She thought maybe she wasn't fit to be a mother, but she worked through it and she became, for my money, the best mother in the state of Texas.
I love that even in Hank's struggles to open up here, he instead defaulted to just fully gushing about how much he loves Peggy. I think that even though Hank struggles with that old world mentality of keeping your emotions in, his attempts at emotional vulnerability are propping up someone he loves. That's pretty sweet. It's a really great Hank and Peggy episode.
And we work through it together, Hank. Mwah.
The way this story morphs into such a rumination on Hank and Peggy's relationship also ties it pretty effectively into the other side of the episode, focusing on Bobby and Connie's reconnection as friends. Overall, I really loved the way this season approached their reconnection over its 10 episodes. It didn't feel rushed and it was taken one step at a time. And this one starts the story by once again showcasing that Emilio is the man. Now, previously I said I was hoping we'd see Bobby's surrounding character cast expand a bit in his life in Dallas, and I still stand by that, but on rewatch, I'm really seeing how much Emilio fits into both Bobby's personal and professional life. He is just in full-on wingman mode here, trying so hard to help Bobby navigate reconnecting with Connie, giving him texting advice, and then just hitting him with this affirmation when Connie shows up at the restaurant.
I believe in you, Bobby.
Man, he's the best. I also do really love the runner that Bobby is awful at texting. I think that's such a fun quirk that's very real for some people. Bobby feels like the type of guy who would be totally chill and charismatic in person and on the fly, but when left with too much time, could devolve into overthinking and acting unnaturally. I feel like this is a good extension of like the episode I'm with Cupid, when Bobby completely panics and overthinks his recent breakup with Connie and embarrasses himself over and over trying to win her back. Bobby is great when he's in his element, but prone to panic when he's not. And this episode also highlights this exact tendency after Connie reveals that Chain invited her to the restaurant and that the pair of them are actually dating. Something I'm sure many people anticipated, and a through line this season that I think is really handled well from a character perspective for Connie. But Bobby's initial reaction fully leads to that aforementioned unnatural panicky tendency we've seen from Bobby before, this time manifesting as awkward probing questions while taking their order.
And after you're done eating, should I put each of your leftovers in separate boxes?
I feel like this is also a really good show of Bobby's integrity here. When Connie opens up to him that she feels like she's struggling to connect with Chain, Bobby actually points out that Chain is likely insecure because of the pressures put on him by his father, which is of course a pressure that Connie can deeply relate to. Bobby could have used the opportunity to further divide Connie and Chain and try to get himself in the mix, but let's be honest, Bobby wouldn't have felt good about doing things that way.
You're a good man, Bobby Hill. Dumb, but good.
I actually love that though Bobby is clearly struggling emotionally here, given his romantic past with Connie, his initial priority really is for them to be friends again. Sure, he'd love to rekindle the romance, but he'd rather be your friend than nothing, which Joseph feels incredulous about. But I think that's genuine here. In the original show, Bobby and Connie were actually friends before and after their breakup, longer than they were together, and they were great as friends as well, and I really appreciate that this is what the episode is about first and foremost. And also that even though Bobby has always been suave and personable, Joseph is still able to help wingman Bobby in ways where he's a little more adept. He helps prevent Bobby from that classic overthinking mindset, like after Connie invites him to karaoke.
I bet Chain's going too.
Dude, still, say yes.
Okay.
I gotta say, while I did really enjoy the karaoke bar scene for a lot of reasons, I did think some of this felt a little out of place in terms of the season's pacing. I loved seeing Bobby and Connie's chemistry on display, and I cannot pretend like seeing them sing together didn't hit. But I can't help but feel like that scene and the attempt to pull those nostalgic heartstrings maybe should have come in a later episode. Don't get me wrong, the pair singing Leanne Rimes' How Do I Live on stage, the song that was played during their big emotional dance scene in Love Hurts and So Does Art, it was really effective. It was actually a great scene, especially highlighting the clips of the old episode. That was a nice touch. But I feel like this would have been better served as a bigger romantic reconnection point later in the season, instead of something that was sort of so overtly romantic right off the bat when they're actually just reconnecting as friends for the first time. I know part of the intention here was to throw Bobby for a loop when he realizes that Connie is trying to set him up with her roommate, but I also feel like that makes her karaoke decision make even less sense. Why pointedly use a romantic song that they have a shared experience with if the intention wasn't to rekindle their romance. But maybe the point here is that Connie wasn't really thinking logically and was actually thinking more passionately and nostalgically. Regardless, this was my only real nitpick of the episode, since ultimately it serves as a reforging of their friendship first and foremost. And I did enjoy the other aspects of this karaoke scene. The brief discussion about apps and modern dating culture, and seeing how hilariously work-brained Bobby can be even in social settings.
You've got to ask all those first date questions like, what's your favorite kind of sauce?
Tell me that this isn't Hank Hill's kid. You know Hank would be bringing up propane immediately if he had to go on a date. It was interesting to see Bobby sort of panic when Ola was so forward about hooking up with him. Obviously, we saw him hook up with that girl in the first episode, but it was definitely under the pretense that they had really hit it off together, and he clearly showed interest in seeing her again before she cut it off. Bobby and Ola had a short and sweet conversation, but it's clear that Bobby isn't really into the more random hookup culture. I'd guess if he and Ola met in different circumstances, maybe they'd hit it off, but Bobby was definitely preoccupied after that karaoke duet. It's clear what and who he was thinking about. I really loved the way this episode wrapped up though, with Connie waiting for Bobby at his place, apologizing for blindsiding him with the Ola setup, and opening up to him. I really appreciated that Connie's motivation here was basically a way to try and keep Bobby in her life as friends.
I really want us to be friends, you know?
That's what I want too.
Yeah.
I said it before, but I love that the initial priority in this reconnection is friendship. Bobby and Joseph are a great friend duo, but it does feel like something is missing in their dynamic sometimes. They played this improv game called The Adulterers, where they act out their neighbor's date night, but Joseph cannot for the life of him figure it out. When Connie arrives, she immediately understands it, tags in, and has a great time with Bobby, and her playing along helps Joseph understand it better.
Let me just finish disposing of your husband's dismembered body.
Oh. I don't know, it just feels like these three fit together, and this is a really great moment. It's the first of one of my favorite aspects of the character dynamics in the revival, that the three kids of Rainy Street essentially just become a crew as young adults in Dallas. They always had great chemistry as a gang, even with the occasional drama, and seeing them reconnect and stick together into adulthood was really more satisfying than I expected it to be. And I think they wrote this moment of reconnection really well. It's like the way you might slip back into a comedic bit with an old friend, even if you haven't done it in years. You just fall into old tendencies because you're comfortable around each other. Bobby and Connie always had that chemistry. Overall, I might have a couple issues with some of these episodes, but it really just feels like there's so much more they're nailing than the small things I have to nitpick. This episode delivers a great story on both sides. Hank gets a story that feels classic and explores his new post-retirement insecurities, and Bobby and Connie tug at those nostalgic heartstrings by rekindling their friendship. Truly, so few complaints, they're kinda killing it. And that is all I've got for season 14, episode 4, Chore Money, Chore Problems. King of the Hill's 5th revival episode took a bold step in Hank Hill's evolution that I'm sure nobody will have any thoughts on. It's revealed that he likes soccer now. Soccer, which predictably sets Dale off onto probably the most Dale plot we get in the first revival season. It also gives us a nice little young adult Bobby story as he attempts to buy his first car, leading to very comedic results. This episode manages to fit a lot of great subplots into a single story in a really fun way, so let's dive into season 14, episode 5, New Ref in Town. Alright, let's address the horse in the room. Hank Hill likes soccer? The Hank Hill? The one who explicitly hated soccer in the original run of the show?
Oh yeah, I hate soccer, yes.
Honestly, I totally understand how at a glance people might hate this, but I feel like they mostly handled it really well, particularly because the core of the story is specifically about Hank being worried about his soccer-hating friends judging him. The way the episode eases into the fact that Hank might have a fondness for soccer is very funny, as the gang all expresses their disgust that Luke Jr. is practicing in the alley.
Luke could be the next Lionel Messi.
These are very funny hints. I really like Hank naturally juggling the soccer ball with no issues. Honestly, I think one of my favorite details is that Hank didn't even reveal to Peggy that he liked soccer. That's how ashamed he was, given his very Texan upbringing. I was hoping we might get a bit more of these flashbacks across the season, but I really liked that they jumped back into time spent in Saudi Arabia here, explaining how Hank became interested in the sport in the first place. He was initially just at the stadium to focus on their propane needs.
God dang it, if the beautiful artistry on that field didn't lure me in.
Now, I will admit, I wish they had gone a little bit more in depth into how he started to love the sport. sport. I think it fully makes sense for the character, and I know we've got limited time in these episodes, but seeing exactly how the rules and sportsmanship won him over specifically could have honestly been a fun episode in itself. Like, that's a whole Hank Hill story. But to me, this development still makes a lot of sense. So many of Hank's opinions are rooted in where and how he was raised. But Hank loves sports, athleticism, community, camaraderie, etc., and being away from Texas and the sports he's used to loving, and embedded in a culture that fully loves and embraces soccer, I think it makes a ton of sense that he would find the integrity in that sport and start to appreciate it, even if he was fully a closeted soccer lover. And Dale picking up on the hints that Hank might not hate soccer and using it to fuel an international conspiracy.
Hank was turned in Saudi Arabia.
Turned into what?
A spy, you idiot.
I mean, that's kind of a perfect King of the Hill plot, isn't it? I also think the way Hank sort of felt like he had to step in to start refereeing was really well handled. It really speaks to a sense of fairness and integrity, and starts with him just realizing that Boomhauer was missing a lot of calls as the referee. Like, after these parents complain that it's just about fun and not rules, we get a quintessential Hank Hill line.
Well, the rules make it fun.
Though I will also say, as someone who has really loved the Boomfather arc for Boomhauer and Luke Jr., I was a little bummed to see him just not care about his ref duties and jump on his phone when he got fed up. Disappointing to see from him. He's been doing really well as a father figure so far. But Hank's motivations being purely so that the sport is played fairly and with integrity is a great Hank Hill motivation. And I love that he sees it as this responsibility he has to uphold. Like, he's the only one who can do this the right way, so he's gonna do it. That is Hank Hill.
The disrespect for authority was just so un-American.
But I think my absolute favorite thing about this referee plot is about how Hank taking this up positively affects his and Peggy's marriage. God, this is so funny. They basically see Hank liking soccer as a dirty little secret, and it completely invigorates their love life. That is truly one of the funniest and most Hank and Peggy plots I could think of.
Tell me again about the offsides.
You want to hear it fast or slow?
I really appreciated this exploration of Hank overall. Yeah, he's a stubborn guy with a specific worldview, but we know he's not immune to change, whether that's from peer pressure, growth in understanding underlying integrity, or both. And they really highlighted all the things that Hank would embrace about this specific soccer situation. I liked that even Hank and Peggy discussed this as an evolution for Hank, but not a fundamental change.
Maybe I have evolved. Although I still don't like women shaving their heads and dyeing what's left. They look like fruit.
I thought the Dale plot provided just about everything you'd want out of a Dale conspiracy story. He makes an observation that is absolutely correct, and then just extends that observation to the most insane conclusion, and provides us with some new top-tier Dale lines as well.
I've killed werewolves before. Or at least a really big dog.
I also liked the way Dale sort of used Bill as his stooge/lackey the entire episode. It makes for a pretty fun dynamic when you have a pushover like Bill completely willing to do the bidding of an out-of-control conspiratorial Dale. This also led to one of my favorite Peggy lines in the season, when Bill brings over an apple pie and falafel as a haphazard way to see if Hank and Peggy have become un-American.
Oh, you're sweet, Bill, but I would never eat food that has been in your home.
The way this all culminates in a Dale kidnapping and interrogation. I mean, how else could it culminate? So many fun details in this interrogation scene, especially that the only person on Dale's trusted list is John Redcorn. And I think Hank leaning into Dale's tendency to continue to expand and unfold conspiracies beyond the logical conclusion was a really smart way for him to wrap this up.
I'm a double agent.
While Dale's antics here do get relatively extreme, I feel like this was the proper amount of escalation from Dale's older conspiratorial tendencies. I figured the writers might struggle a bit to find Dale stories, given that a lot of his behavior that we saw as comically out there has become increasingly mainstream. But this to me felt like just enough escalation without reaching levels that were way too silly for me, which is something I sadly cannot say about the resolution of the soccer plot in this one. Unfortunately, the one thing about this episode I did not really like was the reveal that Boomhauer taking over as referee led to the game simply turning into a weird amalgamation of soccer, football, and wrestling. I think visually and conceptually this is kind of a funny idea. I just felt like it went a little too far for King of the Hill. While the show can definitely get out there sometimes, it rarely betrays a sense of reality for the characters. And I have a really hard time with the idea that a single referee could not only change the rules of the sport on the fly, but that all of the players and crowd would go along with it. This kind of thing feels far less believable to me than Hank coming around on soccer, and it takes me out of the world a little bit too much. But outside of this resolution, I really enjoyed this storyline. This episode also has a really fun but low-stakes Bobby B plot where he decides to buy his first car, and I love that some of these Bobby stories are just classic young adult milestones. Buying your first car isn't some insane storyline, but it is a big part of life. This B plot does a lot of things I really appreciated. For one, I really love the fact that Joseph, Bobby, and Connie just have fully settled into their friend trio as young adults. Connie is clearly doing schoolwork on her laptop, but she chose to do it over at Bobby and Joseph's place. It's a small but significant detail. I also love that Connie seems to really understand Bobby. Though he's clearly very motivated to make this car purchase happen on his own, Connie expresses concern that he'll get swindled, and even suggests that he should have his mom help him. For one, I love that she says Peggy and not Hank should help him. A subtle allusion to the season 12 episode, The Accidental Terrorist, where Hank learns that paying sticker price for a car every time actually meant he'd been swindled for his entire life. But two, I also love that, though this might come across as a bit insulting, it does speak to the things that make Bobby, well, Bobby.
Those car dealers are slick, and you're just too nice.
He's an incredibly sweet and trusting guy, and these are the things that Connie likes about him, even if her concern might come across as condescending here. And obviously, in the end, Connie was right to be concerned, though not in the way anybody expected. Bronco Barry feigns defeat in the car negotiation, only to somehow convince Bobby that if he doesn't take the horse from the commercials off his hands, he's gonna put it down.
I know a nice guy like you wouldn't murder a sweet horse like this.
Honestly, this is such a funny swindle. I don't think anybody expects to go buy a new car and come home with a free horse. Not to mention that Bronco Barry is just a very funny side character. I love that the revival season continued the trend of giving lots of supplementary roles to Stephen Root, who obviously always did an excellent job as Bill and Buck, but he's a pretty versatile performer, and I'm sure the number of characters he's played over the show over the years is in the dozens. But the absolute highlight of this Bobby B story for me is Joseph initially panicking before falling in love with the horse.
Oh, I love you, horse!
Bobby and Joseph dropping everything to try and take care of the horse is short-lived and funny, but it's the resolution to this story that I loved most, where they call John Redcorn for help. Now, these 10 episodes haven't really explored it too in-depth, but I do think there's a lot of interesting subtext to the John Redcorn and Joseph relationship. Obviously, it doesn't seem like they are particularly close, and the show does seem to be playing the game where they hint that Redcorn and Nancy might still be seeing each other without outright confirming it. But the Joseph angle is what interests me most. Joseph went through a variety of feelings about John Redcorn in the original show, being pretty turned off by him at times like in Spin the Choice, but also clearly admiring him at other times like in Vision Quest. Obviously, it's clear that Joseph still doesn't know the truth about his parentage, but it seems like he has largely come around on John Redcorn in the interim years.
Ah, John Redcorn made it. Hey, John Redcorn! Young Gribble.
I also love the detail here that John Redcorn calls Joseph Young Gribble, maybe a subtle nod to the fact that he has seemed to have accepted Joseph as Dale's son. And obviously, the revival has done a great job in exploring all the ways Joseph takes after Dale. But it's also interesting to note that Joseph seems to be driving John Redcorn's old Jeep, also a nice nod to the fact that John Redcorn has continued to support Joseph from afar in the ways that he can. I really loved this moment where John Redcorn sees how much Joseph loves that horse and has this little dream sequence about the pair riding in the desert together. I know a lot of people have strong negative feelings about John Redcorn, but I think Joseph finding a natural connection point with his birth father is in no way a bad thing, especially because John Redcorn clearly doesn't have any delusions about who Joseph's real family is. I think if this show is able to showcase just how much Joseph is truly Dale's son, while also providing a potential way for Joseph to connect with John Redcorn and possibly learn more about his heritage, it's kind of a win-win, especially with Joseph going around talking about how he's white in other episodes. I feel like there has to be a point where he learns the truth. But I really loved how Bobby gently pushes Joseph and John Redcorn together, also seeing the value in them finding ways to bond.
But that sounds like a great thing for you and Joseph to do together.
I'm sorry, but you cannot make me hate the hope in John Redcorn's eyes right here. I will say, while I really liked this B-plot, it is maybe an example of how the revival sometimes feels like two separate shows simultaneously. Since Bobby and the gang are in Dallas, there's very little crossover with the A story. In this one, they made it happen with a simple phone call from Bobby to Peggy, and I think they're doing well with what they're working with, since I don't really have any better alternative here, but it is something I noticed. Like, this B story really could have slotted in with any number of other A stories since they were so disconnected. But these are nitpicks, and I don't put a ton of stock in them, because overall, there's just so much more good in this formula than bad. Overall, I think this is a really fun episode. While I maybe didn't love the ending to the referee plot, I really liked the way it explored Hank's ability to change and the peer-driven shame he feels alongside that change. It provided a super fun angle for Dale's conspiracy and a solid young adult milestone for Bobby that allowed for some really sweet moments. Overall, it's just another solid episode. And that is all I've got for Season 14, Episode 5, New Ref in Town. King of the Hill's 6th episode of its revival season gave us maybe our straight-up funniest premise with Bill's new barbershop antics, and also puts a nice focus on some of Peggy's post-retirement insecurities. But maybe most notably, this one has a major focus on relationships, especially on the Bobby/Connie side of things. There is a lot to dive into, so let's talk about Season 14, Episode 6, Peggy's Fade Out. Obviously, based on the title and the initial focus for the episode, all things pointed to this being a Peggy episode. It maybe could have maintained a focus on Peggy a bit better, but it's definitely still a Peggy episode. It opens with Peggy having been rejected for a job at Heimlich Community College, and Peggy believing her experience haggling in Saudi Arabia equated to a 2-year master's degree in economics. Maybe one of my favorite Peggy ego moments of the new season. But as opposed to Hank, who spends his free time finding new hobbies and odd jobs, Peggy takes this rejection as a sign to give up.
I am just leaving academia behind and embracing retirement.
But I like that after really focusing on Hank's post-retirement woes, this one puts a spotlight on Peg and focuses less on how to fill her time and more on her fears that she actually hasn't done anything worthwhile in her life. Her search for meaning post-retirement is less about boredom and more about the insecurity that she maybe has nothing left to accomplish, that she's peaked and is in decline.
This feels like everyone else is doing bigger and better things with their lives.
They do a nice job showcasing this in small ways early. It opens by showing Min's new lifestyle blog. It feels like they make a point to show this small ad for Nancy and John Redcorn's new show, Selling Arlen. But this episode does start to intertwine with a Bill story, and it is admittedly an incredibly funny Bill story. All of the gang thinks that Bill's been lying about having other friends, and as Hank says, has fallen off the reality wagon. And to be fair, this isn't an unusual expectation of Bill given his history. Pretty Dresses is a prime example of him really falling off the reality wagon. Back then, in an attempt to cope with Lenore having left him, and so making up an entire new group of friends to cope with Hank leaving town isn't very far-fetched for the character either. But they subvert this in some really funny ways, because while Bill has definitely fallen off the reality wagon in some regards, his friends are not imaginary. I gotta say, giving Bill a story in a black barbershop is genuinely so funny and inspired. Obviously, we've gotten some great Bill Barber stories over the show, whether that was back at the military base or when he pretended to be gay to style at the salon, but black barbershops tend to be known for being these supportive pillars of their community, a place where people meet and hang out and joke and give advice. So a character like Bill, who struggles immensely with self-esteem and feeling seen and supported, finding community in one of these places, it's just a great episode idea. I mean, we also might never see something as funny as Hank getting dapped up ever again, but they essentially tie Peggy's insecurities directly to Bill's insecurities here, as both have stories about fearing how their life and accomplishments are perceived by others. Bill, as it turns out, was lying to Lucas and the boys at the barbershop about, well, all of the details of his life. He was even projecting all of his deepest insecurities onto what he told them about Hank.
Hold up. This is the neighbor you told us about? He's not fat and disgusting at all.
Honestly, though, I'm kind of shocked that Hank didn't absolutely blow up at Bill's biggest transgression here, since the entire gang seems to think that Bill is married to Peggy, complete with a huge array of photoshopped photos of her. This is so crazy. Did Bill learn Photoshop for this? Did he hire someone? But the fact that Bill is using Peggy as a means to brag about his life is exactly how it ties back to her story. Now, I do wish that this episode had maybe maintained more of a focus on Peggy, even if the supplementary Bill plot is very funny. While both plots definitely do hone in on her here, it also feels like they're a bit limited on Peggy's screen time, which I kinda hate to see in an episode that is specifically about Peggy, but I still did enjoy the way these plots intertwined.
He said being married to you makes him more confident and likable.
I love that this basically forces Peggy to reconcile with two very strong and conflicting feelings. One, her desire to be seen as successful and appreciated, and two, her disgust with Bill Dauterive. But of course, she's she's flattered by the way that her phony presence in Bill's life actually elevates his status. That's a pretty great and clear Peggy Hill dilemma. Side note, can we appreciate this visual gag about Peggy's Substitute Teacher of the Year awards? She's got her award for 1997 here, and then the award for 1999 has her own first name taped over another first name, an allusion to the 1999 episode The Little Horrors of Shop, when Hank was poised to win this award, but was suspended from school before they could award it to him. Very funny attention to detail for this gag, even though because of the floating timeline, firmly establishing anything from the show having taken place in 1997 or 1999 is a real chronological disaster, but just don't think about it too hard. But Peggy basically wants to live vicariously through Bill's delusions here, and instead of putting a stop to them, she starts offering notes to punch up his stories.
Can you tell them that I was hired by the Heimlich Community College? No, the University of Texas.
But of course, the moment the reality of Bill's delusions hit her, particularly on the romantic side of things, she comes to her senses.
And this lie today.
Okay, while I do maybe wish this had felt a little more robust in how it intertwined Peggy and Bill's stories, and had maybe allowed a bit more of a focus on Peggy screen time-wise, I truly did love this ending. The way Bill ends the lie is by killing Peggy off, which is obviously insane, but it allows for this really touching final moment. Obviously, the getting to experience your own funeral fantasy is not a new idea. I'm willing to bet many of you have even thought about this for yourselves. The opportunity to hear what people would most remember about you at the end of your life. It's an alluring idea, and they built out a premise here where Peggy actually does get to experience this. But what I found really nice is that while Bill did lie about his life to all of these people, he didn't really lie about Peggy's life. He told them who she was, that she was a substitute teacher, that she had gone to the Middle East. Bill was proud to share who Peggy truly was because he really does think incredibly highly of her.
She published her musings in the paper and adventured to the Middle East, where she mastered their languages.
And yeah, obviously she didn't master these languages, but both Bill and Peggy think she did. I just really love the idea of this ending because although it's just Bill, he has always had such a genuine and massive fondness for Peggy. And this brief little experience of Peggy getting that perspective, getting to see what she looks like to Bill as he sings her praises in front of friends, it was really sweet. It's a nice episode and this is a nice ending, even if it's pretty silly and out there.
And although she didn't always succeed in everything, she was always an inspiration.
Okay, let's dive into Bobby's side of the episode, which I think is a tiny bit less cohesive story-wise, but does a ton to drive the more serialized nature of Bobby's revival arc. And they do this in two major ways. One, establishing the King of the Grill competition, and two, continuing Bobby's romance journey. Let's talk King of the Grill. Obviously, the name is also a meta-textual nod to the name of this show, and they make this very clear in the jokes as well.
That Texas cooking show that Fox stupidly canceled 15 years ago?
Very on the nose, but it does seem like these revivals feel obligated to throw in jabs and metatextual references like this. Futurama's first DVD movie, Bender's Big Score, did the whole Box Network gag, and then on Hulu they signed a deal with Fulu. I think this one-off line is a little more forgivable than the Fulu thing. But I really like this potential storyline they're setting up here, that Bobby wants to try and get onto this cooking competition show to help drum up interest in his cuisine and in Robota Chain. We've talked about it before, but obviously Bobby had two major loves in the original run, comedy/performance art and cooking. I love that he pursued cooking as a career, but the show has also made sure not to abandon references to his love of comedy, performing, and his previous aspirations.
With his silly dreams of being on TV and making bad jokes all day.
To me, Bobby wanting to get on a cooking competition show is a pretty great way to marry his two loves. The guy is clearly a great and inspired chef, but being given a platform where he can really embrace his showmanship alongside his actual cooking skills makes so much sense. Obviously, often these kinds of shows are just as much about the personalities and personal stories of the contestants as well as their abilities. It would be cool to see Bobby find more ways to marry his passions. But this is mostly set up for future stuff. The episode also establishes some interesting info about his business arrangements with Robota Chain, primarily that he doesn't have a substantial salary because he instead took 15% ownership in the restaurant. A fascinating insight for sure, and one that also helps us understand his workaholic tendencies. He really is betting betting on himself here, which also means if he manages to make a name for himself on King of the Grill, that bet could really pay off. Another small subplot of this story is Bobby hiring Dale to exterminate the rat in Robota Chain. It's definitely not substantial, but I do appreciate all the ways they're finding to fit some great Dale action in this season. I feel like his plan to lure in the rat by releasing his own Judas rat into the store echoes his strategies in my literal favorite Dale episode of the entire series, Megalo Dale, when he released other rats and a mongoose into the Megalomart to try and catch Chuck Mangione. God, I love that episode. But it definitely seems like the bulk of the Bobby side of this episode is about his romantic life, which is kicked off by Bobby revealing to Connie that Chain was seen kissing another girl in public, and Connie then revealing to Bobby that they're actually ethically non-monogamous, so this was chill. People have had thoughts about this side of Connie's story, and I do have to say, anyone crying character assassination, I think is definitely projecting their own beliefs onto Connie. Now, there is a lot going on with Connie's romantic decisions in the King of the Hill revival, but we won't fully dive into the character analysis side of things quite yet because there's a lot more revealed in subsequent episodes, but I think we can talk about some of the most important aspects here. For one thing we know about Connie's childhood is that she had an incredibly overbearing father who controlled just about every aspect of her life, from her schoolwork to her extracurriculars to her dating life. Obviously, he heavily pushed for Connie to date Chain when they were younger to try and cozy up to the Wasana songs. Con even tried to bribe Bobby to break up with Connie in the episode that actually would ultimately be where Bobby and Connie's relationship ended, though mutually, not via bribe. But I think with these super overbearing teenage years, as well as a demanding workload in school, it makes sense that Connie, in her early 20s, would actually be more interested in a bit of freedom in her dating life. Now, there's a lot more to analyze in a future breakdown about why Connie would end up with Chain for this arrangement, but the important thing we know here is that a big part of it is because she isn't looking at him as a long-term or serious partner.
Do you love him?
I like him. For this.
I do sort of understand why people might feel a little turned off by Connie's attitude towards Bobby here. To me, it's very clear that she likes and respects Bobby, but she's in a place in her life where she recognizes that her wants and desires don't line up with what he offers, and that she knows him well enough that he isn't interested in any kind of open relationship.
You'd end up getting hurt. And I would never do that to you.
I think this is pretty intentionally written to make Bobby feel a little condescended to. And I think that's one of the things that people aren't loving about the Connie x Bobby thing this season. But though she maybe could have said this a little more tactfully, she is absolutely right. Connie knows Bobby, and they've established pretty clearly that he is a soft lover boy type who is looking for more than no strings attached fun. Again, there will be future breakdowns to really dive into Connie's psychology behind all of this, but I think this episode establishes what it needs to. That at this point in her life, Connie isn't looking for anything serious, and of course what the episode reveals later is that Bobby is absolutely the type of person she'd be looking for if she were ready for something serious. But the other part of this story is the whole Willow connection. Bobby catches her stealing his grease so she can make soaps and balms with it, and I honestly got such a good laugh out of how this line would so specifically be a flattering turn on to Bobby.
You have good taste in fats and tallows.
Oh, thank you.
Honestly, I think Willow is a really fun character. She's a different archetype than the characters who carried over from the Arlen days, and I think her hippie-ish of the Earth vibes bring a fun dynamic to the gang. But I mostly like her because she has really genuine chemistry with Bobby. Their introduction and their little drunken hang was very cute, but the awkward meeting with Connie at Bobby's the next morning also gave some pretty fun insight into why Bobby was attracted to her. For one, after Connie had been sort of condescending with the "you're not E&M material" comment, Willow basically condescends towards the entire E&M lifestyle in front of Bobby and Connie. It definitely felt like Bobby appreciated this little bit of petty payback, chuckling at her comments about it. But I think my favorite moment in this episode is this piece of advice Willow gave Bobby, recalling that he had said he was inspired to become a chef by his weekends spent grilling with Hank.
That was sweet. You should include it in your audition tape for that show.
For one, just as a fan of King of the Hill, this is exactly the type of fan servicey confirmation I'm looking for. The original run ended with this amazing shot of Bobby and Hank grilling together, and Hank promising Bobby that he'll be grilling for the rest of his life. And this confirms that they continued this connection at least until Hank left the country. But I also just think that they do a great job showcasing that Bobby and Willow have a real connection. It isn't just an empty hookup or something Bobby is doing to make Connie jealous. I particularly loved that Bobby invited invited both Willow and Connie to hang out with him and Joseph after this, and that they all genuinely seem to have a nice time. I think this season of King of the Hill could have really easily fallen into messy love triangle tropes between the Connie and Shane stuff, the Bobby and Willow stuff, etc. But it feels like they mostly handle the character relationships with a sense of maturity. Yeah, they showcase a range of feelings and opinions about the types of relationships they pursue, but that's true to life. Everyone's got a take. And I think this actually ties to the idea of this ending beat here with the 3 rats as well. Tell me if you read this differently, because I wasn't so sure on my first watch, but it turns out Dale's plan to release multiple other rats into the restaurant actually did end up catching them all, as they all just started hooking up with each other.
They were so busy fighting over each other, they didn't know what hit them.
I feel like the idea here is to highlight how the younger gang handled these romantic tensions. Obviously, there could have been messy love triangle fighting over each other, whether that's with Connie and Shane or Connie and Willow, but Bobby handled everything pretty level-headedly. He invited Connie and Willow to hang, and they all had a great time. But if they had devolved into that messy love triangle scenario, they could have easily gotten distracted from what's actually going on around them. They could have lost sight of the rest of their lives, getting caught in some metaphorical rat trap. Overall, this was just another solid episode. Not a favorite of the season, and with only 10 episodes a year, I do wish they had put a bit more focus on Peggy, since it forced her to split screen time with Bill, but I can't pretend these stories didn't intertwine in a really fun way. And it did some great work establishing some of the most important aspects of the ongoing serialized Bobby romance story. It's really fun. Good episode. And that is all I've got for season 14, episode 6, Peggy's Fade Out. King of the Hill's 7th episode of their first revival season gave us another really great Bobby and Hank storyline, with the fun and subversive wrench thrown in the mix via Willow. On top of that, we got a pretty fun Peggy subplot with a little Dale action sprinkled on top, and it's historically quite funny when Peggy and Dale get up to hijinks. As usual, there's lots to talk about here, so let's dive into season 14, episode 7, Any Given Hill Day. I've mentioned while covering other episodes that sometimes the new season of King of the Hill can feel like 2 separate shows, since half of the time we're covering Hank and Peggy in Arlen, and the other half we're covering Bobby in Dallas. But they do make sure to have at least a few episodes where those halves cross over, and this is a solid example of that, putting Bobby in a little bit of an existential crisis about how much time he spends with his dad. The episode opens with a very funny and very dark joke where this patron of Robata Chain smells burnt toast, immediately cutting to his funeral afterwards. A stroke of bad luck, if you will. But this did serve 2 very strong purposes for the episode. One, I really liked the way it showcased the kind of person Willow is, willing to go to a random funeral with her new boyfriend. I also think this line goes a long way to help define her character.
I love the pageantry of funerals.
And the second purpose this funeral served was to send Bobby into that aforementioned existential crisis, realizing that the man who died is the same age and has a lot of commonalities with his own dad. This is definitely a great young adult dilemma for Bobby, the realization that your parents aren't going to be around forever, further escalated by the fact that not only were they across the world from each other for a few years, but now live in entirely different cities and don't see each other as often. I loved the way this pretty immediately highlighted the ways Bobby has actually become quite a bit like Hank.
But I won't have to say anything if I can show him I love him.
I mean, I guess there's a chance here that the idea is Bobby knows Hank would be uncomfortable by that kind of outward vocalization of affection, and he's adjusting his behavior for Hank. But regardless, it says a lot that Bobby is more focused on acts of service than words of affirmation. That is very Hank. I mean, the entire pilot episode is about Hank struggling to tell Bobby he loves him. So either this is an illustration of some of Bobby's Hank-like tendencies, or it's showing Bobby's understanding of Hank's tendencies. But I really appreciated the structure of this episode. It effectively paints 2 dilemmas for Bobby. 1, trying to connect with Hank a little bit better, and 2, the always stressful, will my parents like my girlfriend concern. And to be fair, for the latter dilemma, Willow really misreads Hank and does not do herself any favors. But even before the dinner, Hank and Peggy aren't stoked about catering to a vegan. It's interesting to see where they split on this, because Peggy starts off pretty condescending towards the idea, but then later shifts a little bit towards being more accepting and accommodating.
It's important we respect her culture.
Weird isn't a culture. I don't have to respect weird.
And honestly, while I do quite like Willow, it's crazy how bad she is at reading the room at the Hill House. Calling him Hank and straight up airplaning some vegan lasagna into his mouth. Willow, girl.
You're welcome to call us Mr. and Mrs. Hill.
I think one of the issues I have with the episode is just how disparate Willow's understanding of situations at hand can be. Don't get me wrong, I actually really like Willow, and I like Willow and Bobby together, but one moment she's supporting him at a funeral, the next she's force-feeding Hank vegan lasagna, one moment she's scored Hank and Bobby tickets to Cowboys Fantasy Camp, the next she reveals that she's also going to Cowboys Fantasy Camp with them. And I mean, the kissing Bobby over the table, did I say read the room before? Sort of a nightmare first impression for Hank and Peggy. But I suppose that this is what makes the events at camp pretty satisfying. They really set this up as sort of the worst possible scenario. Hank and Bobby coming so close to finding a way to connect, only for Bobby's new girlfriend to sort of throw that big wrench in things. There are some moments I really love between Hank and Bobby thrown in here, before the wrench throwing of course. Hank's initial excitement for the fantasy camp is really sweet, but I particularly love this moment where he's talking to one of the other dads at the fantasy camp whose son plays football at Ole Miss.
I'm here with my son too. He's a chef.
These are small moments, but for Hank, this is super meaningful. Think about the original series and how often Hank would get excited anytime Bobby got anywhere near success that was related to sports. Like when he became the football mascot.
So you're not prancing around the garage at all, you're training.
Now, obviously, Bobby never really found success in anything sports related, but this dad just told Hank that his son plays Division I football in college, and Hank's response was to equally excitedly tell that dad that Bobby is a chef. Hank has such a genuine pride for Bobby's career that he's happy to mention it in the same breath as a Division I football player. I think they've come a really long way, but this episode actually turns out to be one of those classic Hank is won over by integrity King of the Hill stories. Briefly, at least. Even though both Hank and Bobby do pretty well and are among the best on their fantasy camp team, Willow, as it turns out, is incredibly athletic.
How did a vegan learn to do that?
I think this is a really strong formula for the episode because there are two major dilemmas, and the solution to one of those dilemmas comes at the cost of the solution to the other dilemma. Because of Hank's newfound connection with Willow despite their major differences, his connection point with Bobby over the fantasy camp diminishes.
Can we swap seats so I can talk strategy with Willow?
I think this episode also gives some really interesting insight into Willow as a character. We learn that her father drank himself to death after losing his job with the Cowboys, which makes even being at the fantasy camp difficult for her emotionally. And I think that says a lot about what she's willing to do to try and connect with Bobby and Hank. Though, obviously, eventually, the pain gets the better of her, but we'll get there. She obviously connects with Hank due to her history with the Cowboys and her athletic talent.
We're teammates now, so call me Hank.
Despite the place that this episode ultimately goes, for me, this moment of advice between Willow and Bobby is one of the sweetest moments of the season, and it leads to more of the best emotional moments of connection between Bobby and Hank. Willow really facilitates Bobby's arc in this episode. The beginning of the episode shows Bobby fearing the eventual loss of his father, and then shows him trying to find a way to show Hank he cares about him without saying it. But Willow, having actually lost her father, has the experience to know that sometimes you just have to say it.
Want my advice? Talk to Hank while he can still talk back.
And I really love how Hank and Bobby sort of ease into talking about the more important stuff. First, Hank just opens up to Bobby a bit about how dang sore he is, and how he feels he might be getting too old for this kind of thing. And Bobby relates to this by talking about how he feels after a day working at the restaurant. And the pair share this classic sports experience together, an ice bath. Feels like a very Hank Hill thing to want to share with his son. Okay, so the next thing though, might be the most conflicted I've felt about anything in the season. Don't get me wrong, it's pretty funny, and I think it does track with Willow as a character, at least as we've grown to understand her, but dropping a bomb on Jerry Jones' desk felt maybe a tiny bit more crude than I would have anticipated for King of the Hill. I'm trying to think of something comparable from the original series, and I don't think it extends too far beyond the tone of the show, but it did just stand out to me as something kinda crazy that I might not have expected before we went into the revival season. Funny animation though, Hank's eyes following the drop is nuts. I guess guess before we get to the nice emotional and narrative wrap-up of this one, maybe we should talk about the Peggy subplot. And they start by covering a very modern trend that has become increasingly normalized. Basically the idea that so many of us are just willingly participating in a full-on surveillance state, spurred on by Nancy's Ring camera showing a door-to-door surveyor of some kind.
I should post this and warn everyone.
Everyone has a camera on their front door. Everyone shares their suspicions about people in their neighborhood anonymously on an app. Nobody trusts each other, which I think is a pretty great inciting idea for Peggy to struggle with here.
You don't have a Ring camera, Peggy Hill?
No, we have a doorbell that rings.
The de-evolution of your standard neighborhood community is kind of a perfect Hill family dilemma. Honestly, so much of the primary focus of the original show was on the community built in and around Rainy Street. The literal most iconic image of King of the Hill is the four guys hanging out in the alley drinking beer next to each other. So Peggy returning to Arlen to find that people order laundry detergent to their house instead of going to the drugstore, and that their neighbors are afraid to answer their door, is understandably upsetting. That is a massive, fundamental change in societal attitude. So I love that Peggy's bone to pick here is in favor of community, a real attempt to bring back that old school neighborly feeling that so much of King of the Hill exemplified, in a time where people are increasingly isolated and individualistic.
We did not evolve from caves to hide behind screens, Hank.
And I love that this comes in the form of this little community book nook, a more positive modern trend in terms of community building, but Peggy basically tries to build a common space for the neighborhood to enjoy something together, a reason for them to be face to face instead of viewing each other suspiciously through apps and cameras. And initially, it really works. I love the montage of the neighborhood coming through, checking out books, reading at the bench, setting up lemonade stands, Peggy peeking from the window to see it all going so well. It's really nice stuff. But the real fun of the episode is that Peggy's plan to bring people together also basically justifies those fears that caused people to act suspiciously towards each other, because it facilitates a bedbug infestation. Such a funny route to go with this one, for Peggy to make this big effort to undo what she feels is a societal regression, bringing people together only for that exact act to fully harm the community she's building. And obviously, this is a perfect storyline to bring Dale in on. For one, exterminator, duh. But two, Dale is the guy in the neighborhood who lives and breathes suspicion. And also Dale and Peggy are historically a wild pairing. Pretty sure it was Dale's influence that led to them nearly killing Randy Travis. But the funniest thing about this dilemma is that in order to prevent the blame being pushed onto Peggy for the bedbugs, she and Dale have to push blame onto a variety of other folks in the neighborhood.
I spray the rest of the houses that brought home your buggy books. I make money, you get off scot-free.
So the exact thing that Peggy was fighting against to begin with, suspicion and distrust towards your neighbors, which dismantles their sense of community, she is now pushing and facilitating through Dale, who starts various rumors about where the bedbugs came from to alleviate suspicion from Peggy. Very funny stuff. And despite the Peggy Hill hypocrisy, the final resolution is also that same brand of sweet peppered with irony. Peggy takes responsibility, and the entire neighborhood comes together by burning all of the books. Certainly not a coincidence that a storyline about surveillance state tendencies ends in a pile of burning books, especially with this little bit earlier in the episode where Bill was reading 1984. And Bill also maybe gets the sweetest piece of character development here, despite barely being a part of the episode. He tosses a book in the fire that turns out to be his wedding album disguised. That's really nice stuff. Nice to see Bill moving on in some way.
You definitely brought the neighborhood together.
Stop trying to make me feel better.
Okay, let's back it up to the other sweet resolution over at Cowboys Fantasy Camp. Obviously, the Jerry Jones office incident was a huge deal breaker for Hank. This is when Willow opens up about her father's drinking and death, and I like that despite what they witnessed, Bobby remains really sympathetic towards what Willow is going through. He's a good guy. But their subsequent abandonment of Fantasy Camp gives us another of my favorite Hank and Bobby scenes in the revival, and a real perfect culmination of Bobby's arc in this episode. A scene where he really opens up to Hank about something he's going through, and Hank receives it and gives advice. Despite this being spurred on because of Willow's behavior here, it is still the embodiment of Willow's advice to Bobby earlier in the episode. He talks to his dad while he still can. I think my only real issue with this is that basically Bobby's opening up to Hank sort of results in him unloading all of these little issues he had with Willow as a partner, which is absolutely all fine stuff to take issue with, but I think I just wish we had maybe gotten a little bit more time in the show show to see these issues. Because outside of Willow's big Jerry Jones moment, which was motivated by years of pain and trauma, Willow was a pretty great girlfriend to Bobby. She was very supportive and patient and understood his needs, and I think I wish we had seen a bit more about how they were incompatible. And I do hope she sticks around in the show in some capacity in the future because she's a cool character. But ultimately, these concerns were always superseded by what Bobby tells Hank here, which is that he thinks he's still in love with Connie. I love the little detail that Bobby revealing this leads to Hank cracking a little smile here. Just great, subtle Hank Hill character acting. And I think this exchange is one of the best Bobby-Hank exchanges in the entire season.
I appreciate you, Dad.
Well, let's not get carried away.
Perfect slight deflection from Hank for the tiniest bit of affection. Pretty great. I do think that overall, this was another solid episode. It maybe had things like the Jerry Jones drop that I felt might be a tad crude for King of the Hill, but it still also worked well within the story itself. I also might have a few misgivings about the tightrope they tried to walk with Willow as a character. It's tough to make a character who both seems incredibly supportive and nurturing, but also incapable of reading the room sometimes. Ultimately, I feel like maybe just a little more time with Willow could have gone a long way, which of course is tough when we're only getting 10 episode seasons. They had to compartmentalize this little Willow arc into 2 episodes, and I'd expect if this had been your classic 22 episode season, she probably would have been around for 4 or 5 episodes before they split. But despite this, the story facilitated some tried and true King of the Hill formulas and gave us very funny moments. It's got a strong Peggy subplot that explores a modern dilemma without leaning too far into Flanderized territory for her, and one of those excellent Hank and Bobby moments of connection that the revival seemed to nail time and time again. It's definitely hard to be too upset about some of these perceived slight missteps when they have such a clear view of the bigger picture and have nailed the characterization. And that is all I've got for season 14, episode 7, Any Given Hill Day. King of the Hill's 8th episode of its 14th season is arguably the story with the biggest, most lasting consequences of any released in the revival so far, with a major focus on both Con Supernusumpones, Senior and Junior. This is also Con Senior's only episode in this season, which might be seen as a good or bad thing depending on what kind of fan you talk to, but the themes of this episode can basically be boiled down to relationships, honesty, and community, and for me, it features some of my favorite individual character moments of the season. So let's dive into season 14's aptly titled 8th episode, Conscious Uncoupling. Okay, so let's start by addressing the elephant in the room. Yes, Con was recast, and no, people are not pleased with the new performance, as Ronnie Chang replaces Toby Huss.
Missed again, Hank Hill.
I have thoughts about why the performance doesn't seem to work as well for myself and many fans, but I'm going to push that discussion to the end of the video so we can focus on the actual story first. I do think it was a strange move for the writers to sideline Con for almost the entire season, and only bring him in for a single episode that is primarily about him and Min's marital problems. I actually quite like the episode, but I do think Con's absence was felt during the entire season, and his sudden reappearance made that absence feel stranger. I also think that only using Con in one episode that highlights that he's at such a low point also makes this a harder pill to swallow. If we had maybe seen a bit more of him outside of this one story that was focused on his marriage falling apart, I think people might have accepted the sad nature of this episode a bit more openly. I mean, even Min, for instance, gets a lot more focus across the season's episodes, and we even see little hints of her life moving forward, like the fact that she started a blog. You know, nothing major, but something more positive and optimistic that's in her life. But I also think that the main conflict of this episode is a very well-written Con and Min story. Of course, they would be the type of couple to try and hide the fact that their marriage has dissolved. That feels 100% in character. They still have dreams of Connie marrying Chain and connecting meaningfully to the Wasanasong family. They want to move up in the social hierarchy.
We hired Robata Chain because of Chain, not Bobby.
They feel like exactly the type of people to put on this facade, but keeping up the charade despite actually having been divorced for over a year, to the point of hosting and paying for a massive anniversary party as well, is such an intense place to go to try and maintain that social status. And their focus on appearances are very apparent throughout the episode, even going so far as to try and make sure Bill doesn't come to the party. This detail included a really natural callback to an event from the original series, an event that actually seemed to have been forgotten within the original series itself.
I still haven't forgiven him for dating my late mother.
Could you?
Despite the sad nature of this episode, it is a very interesting place to take Min and Khan. I know that there is a bit of a trend in reboots to undo happy endings that people don't like, but happy marriages slowly falling apart is a reality that is simply true to life. And I think that Khan and Min's previously very happy marriage, being the subject of this in the reboot, creates for the exact kind of status quo shifts that have made this revival work so well. It provides ample opportunity for new storytelling, even if it sucks that we didn't really get to see the events of their marriage struggles from the interim period. But I'm pretty eager to see how it might shift Khan's direction moving forward, particularly after their marriage is eventually outed as a sham. He seems like a character who was a bit stagnant in his attempts to maintain the status quo and keep up appearances, and now that things have shifted, it will be interesting to see if they put a focus on how he moves on and finds happiness in new ways. He was always very controlling of Connie in a way that felt super self-serving, and it always seemed like he was a bit in over his head when he was sucking up to the Wasana songs, so maybe he'll find a new type of contentment without feeling the need to be motivated by these things. Maybe he'll find new meaning in his work or dating life, or maybe we'll see him and Connie connect as adults. I personally hope that it leads to him accepting Connie a little bit more for who she is. I think if I had one major criticism of this episode though, it's that it maybe doesn't actually focus on Khan quite enough. It doesn't even have much of an arc for him within the text of the episode. It's largely facilitated by two other subplots and characters. The first being Hank, and this is where we get a lot of the comedy in this episode. Hank learns the truth about Khan's marriage just before the anniversary and is forced to keep the secret, something Peggy takes exception to after he outed her false claims about her bowling scores, and also something she points out that he is simply very bad at.
Every time you try to lie, you clean your glasses. It was cute when you told Brian Robertson you voted for Obama, but not now.
And the other subplot and character that ties directly to Khan's deceit and attitude here is Connie. In fact, I would argue that this episode goes a lot further to add depth to Connie's season 1 arc than Khan. Probably one of the reasons that this episode's title, Conscious Uncoupling, is actually dually referencing both Khan Jr. and Sr. So let's dive into Connie, because that really is where the meat of this episode lies. And the added context of Khan and Min's recently dissolved marriage goes a very long way to give us important context to some of Connie's decisions. The decision I see being questioned most is how did Connie end up with Chain after disliking him so much in the original run? And I will say, first of all, obviously people and mindsets change over time. Connie was being forcibly set up with Chain by Khan when she was a kid, and this at least seems to be a bit more voluntary. But obviously Chain is still a huge asshole, and the question is, why would she date him now? And I think this episode pretty thoroughly explains her mindset here. She already hinted in previous episodes that she wasn't in love with Chain, just that she likes dating him in the context of their open relationship. A relationship that is frankly not very serious with each other. Not that open relationships can't be serious, but in this context, she and Chain are decidedly not serious. And I think that last part is the key here. Connie is 21 years old, and seeing her parents' relationship dissolve and become this complete charade has clearly affected how she sees relationships in general. Min points out to Connie that she and Khan got married when they were 21 in an attempt to push her towards that same decision.
Well, Mom, have you ever thought that maybe I don't want to make the same mistakes that you did?
To me, it's clear that Connie is only dating Chain for two reasons. One, it makes things a bit easier on her parents, who really care about appearances and are obviously really struggling under the surface of their marriage. This keeps up appearances with the Wasana songs and their happy family charade. But more importantly, because Connie actually never has and never would take Chain seriously as a long-term romantic partner. Because of the trauma associated with seeing her parents' marriage dissolve, at this point, Connie is completely averse to forming the kind of bond that might actually lead her to want to get married. Dating Chain is basically a deterrent. Connie could never see Chain as marriage material. He's a really firm roadblock to prevent her from making what she perceives as the same mistake her parents made. I also think that Connie's interest in open relationships might also stem from this aversion, which kind of makes this an interesting subject as explored by the show, because funny enough, it doesn't really seem like the show is taking open relationships seriously as a concept. It's pretty clear that Connie and Chain's arrangement is not a healthy one, and ultimately its inclusion sort of just upsets all kinds of different people. I've gotten disappointed comments about how the show isn't actually showcasing a good example of an open relationship, which personally I don't think the show is trying to, but I also get so many angry comments about open relationships existing at all, which I also find funny because from the types of comments I get, people are acting like they're being forced into an open relationship themselves. Ultimately, I think people should probably just worry about their own relationships and not get worked up about other people's arrangements. But hey, you do you. The point is, I don't think the show is painting the open relationship with Chane as the right move for Connie. But the irony of Connie's decision to date Chane here is that her attempts to avoid the kind of relationship that leads to that phony facade her parents have plastered over their own relationship actually caused her to basically fully emulate that exact circumstance in her relationship with Chane.
My parents are just like Chane. They're all about appearances and...
Connie's relationship with Chane itself is a full-on charade. I think most of the time Connie's arrangement with Chane is very low effort and easy, but here in this big public event where she has to play the part of Chane's girlfriend in front of everyone is where the phoniness really gets to her. There's this great moment where Connie is leadingly trying to get Chane to give Bobby credit for the great catering service they've provided, which he's too self-centered to see.
Aren't you forgetting to thank someone else who did?
The troops?
Look, Chane obviously sucks, but let's be real, he's a very funny character. This whole Bobby/Connie build has definitely been the major serialized aspect of this season, and personally, I really do think it was handled well. It's clear that Connie still likes and respects Bobby a lot, but this episode is what gives the context that shows why she simply was not looking to pursue something serious at this point in her life. And obviously, it was made very clear that Connie only saw Bobby as a serious option, not someone to string along or to pursue in an open situation, especially when she just wasn't ready for that kind of a commitment. Hence the your marriage material cookies from Chore Money, Chore Problems. But this episode uses a specific circumstance to showcase why running away from a more serious connection has its cons, pun intended. And it does this by directly comparing Bobby and Chane's reactions to learning about Connie's weird family situation with her parents. After Bobby learns the truth about Con and Min earlier in the episode, news that is hilariously delivered while cha-cha sliding with his parents, Bobby's first instinct is to go and comfort Connie, because of course it is. This is Bobby.
Are you okay?
Not really. But I will be.
Bobby tells Connie he would have been there for her if he'd known the truth, which is a serious contrast to how Chane reacts after everybody learns the truth.
It seems like you have a lot going on. I'm gonna give you some space and get out of here.
Now, obviously, to a degree, this is what Connie wanted from Chane. She specifically was dating Chane because he was not a person she took seriously as a partner. And so Chane's obvious neglect here was more of a wake-up call for Connie that maybe she would like something a little more supportive and meaningful. And this episode does a great job really highlighting the kind of guy Bobby is. Despite the fact that Con only hired Bobby because Chane co-owns the restaurant, Bobby is set on delivering them a wonderful anniversary experience. He pointedly says he wants to make sure it's great for them, and he somehow manages to tightrope walk his genuine concern for Connie without just seeming like he's jealous of Chane. He really cares about Connie's well-being, and the last few minutes of this episode close with truly 3 of my favorite moments in the entire revival season. They just absolutely hit 1, 2, 3. First, Connie confiding in Peggy. I think that while this season didn't really provide a top-tier Peggy Hill episode, it did give her a ton of really funny and lovely moments across the season, and this might be the best one. Maybe the 2 best Peggy lines in the entire season are in this one scene alone. First, when she's talking about her competitiveness with Con and Min.
But one thing we all did right was raise wonderful children. We tied in that.
God, this got me so good, man. What a lovely moment of connection between Peggy and Connie. Peggy obviously watched Connie grow up next door. Outside of her parents, she's got to be one of the closest relationships Connie had to an adult. And so this reaffirmation is probably really meaningful for her. And this next part hits just as hard as Connie voices her fears that she's doomed to continue to repeat her parents' mistakes.
If you decide one day that marriage is for you, Connie, you will be a great wife to a very lucky man. You are not destined to end up like your parents.
God, they really hit with these sentimental moments, and this transitions to another amazing scene immediately where Bobby shows up to bring Connie some food. This scene is a great example of why I love King of the Hill. It starts with one of my favorite comedic Bobby deliveries in the entire show.
I just broke up with Jane.
You did?
But it ends with a gesture that's just perfectly emblematic of Bobby's attitude towards Connie in her most trying time.
I could really just use a hug.
Well, I brought that too.
And if that wasn't enough, the episode closes with an absolute top-tier Con moment. As he packs up his stuff and prepares to finally move out of his garage, Hank and the Alley Boys show up with a six-pack to try and give him support. Of course, Con is Con, he doesn't accept it, shutting the garage door on them, but Hank gently rolls an Alamo to him as the door closes, basically saying, even though you're shutting us out, we're still here for you. Throughout this whole episode, Con and Min treated the Hills really lousily. Con was putting down Hank despite knowing that Hank was keeping his secret. They were throwing Bobby under the bus and refusing to give him credit for his hard work. But ultimately, the Hills knew that the Suppanusimpones were going through it, and despite the way they were treated, they showed up for them when they really needed it. Peggy offering advice to Connie, Bobby being there to support her when she was struggling the most, and Hank extending an Alamo-shaped olive branch to Con despite their constant friction. Now, I do still have some misgivings about how much focus Con was given this season, but this little gesture and moment of community from Hank and the gang was so lovely, and it gives me hope that maybe they'll utilize him more moving forward. Maybe he'll integrate into the gang a little bit. Okay, so let's do it. Let's talk about the voice acting change for Con, with Toby Huss being replaced by Ronnie Chang. I think of all the recasts we've gotten, this is definitely the one that has been met with the most controversy. And I think most people understand this. Ronnie Chang is a very funny performer, and while he does have some Con-like vocalisms, his voice is very different than the Con we know overall.
It's nice to see you too, Chain and Connie. Comedy roast.
Connie Suppanusimpone? Me Chain was on a song.
As someone who was obviously expecting the voice to sound a bit different, I think the reason I brush up against this performance so much is less about the performance itself and more because Con sounds so much younger than he used to, which is especially weird when he's supposed to be older. I think I could have actually bought a vocal change in the character if he had sounded older, but it's sort of a double whammy. Oh, Con sounds different, and he sounds like he's even younger than he was in the original run. That's a tough couple of pills to swallow, but I do also think that they sort of did the character a disservice by, well, not putting him in the show very much. He's literally only in this episode, so it's hard for the audience to get used to a new voice and for a performer to hone in on a performance. There's just such limited screen time for it. I'm not sure if they were pointedly avoiding Con because of the recast or what, but I do hope he's in the show more next season. Even just in small brief appearances here and there, I think that would go a long way to warm the audience up to him and get a little bit more experience under Ronnie Chang's belt as Con. But I do think that the adjustment from Toby Huss to Ronnie Chang has been the most difficult transition for the fans in the new season. Speaking of Toby Huss, let's talk Dale performance while we're here. I should have mentioned in my last breakdown that that was the final Johnny Hardwick episode of the new season, and that the remainder of the show transitions over to Toby Huss as Dale. Though, even the Hardwick episodes seem to contain Huss pickups, and episode 3, Bobby Gets Grilled, was actually a full Huss performance since that was the 7th episode produced and was moved up in the release order. Obviously, it's pretty clear that Hardwick was struggling with his Dale voice when he recorded. A lot of fans thought he was actually the replacement voice. Maybe this was due to health issues, maybe he had just gotten older, but personally, I'm still really grateful we got to hear Hardwick close out his career as Dale. Even if he had lost a step or two, Hardwick is a legend, and I'm so sad we've lost him. Even if he didn't sound the same, obviously I would have drastically preferred that we get an entire revival series of Hardwick Dale performances. But honestly, I do think Huss did an excellent job as his replacement. There are just a few episodes that are 100% Huss as Dale, and I think he gets stronger with each subsequent one. And I really believe he'll continue to get stronger as he settles into the role. He was also forced to sort of try and match his performance to Hardwick with those pickups in earlier episodes, so he'll really be able to find his Dale cadence on his own as he steps into the role solo. I'm really eager to see how he sounds in season 15. Overall, despite my issues with Con's lack of utilization this season, and everyone's frustrations with the voice change, I think this was a really strong episode. That focus on community at the end really hits, and it of course is the most important in moving that Bobby and Connie romance forward. Between the top tier emotional beats and some hilarious sequences, this was a great episode. And that is all I've got for season 14, episode 8, Conscious Uncoupling. King of the Hill's 9th episode of their first revival season has got to be one of the most talked about in series history, for a variety of reasons. For one, it tackles the sort of manosphere influencer space, which is very hot button, and something that feels pointedly more modern than we're used to seeing King of the Hill address. But let's be real, it's the GH factor that has longtime fans really fixated on this story. Hank's younger brother, Good Hank, who has arguably been used more in this one episode than he was in the entire original run of the series. But I think what makes me really excited to talk about No Hank Left Behind is the fact that this episode echoes one of the most important season 1 episodes and showcases the ways certain beliefs and attitudes can rebrand and recycle themselves over time, plus a very strong Bobby and Peggy subplot, all delivered in a classic, heartfelt, sentimental King of the Hill package. So let's dive into season 14, episode 9, No Hank Left Behind.
Let's freaking go!
Alright, before we dive into the episode, yes, they did fudge the timeline on ages a bit with GH. Obviously, GH was born during the original run in the season 3 finale / season 4 premiere, and as we know, Bobby has aged 9 years since that episode. Good Hank should theoretically be 9 years old. However, in season 14, they've established that he is 13 years old. Now, as far as floating sitcom timelines go, personally, I think being a stickler about this is sort of missing the forest for the trees, and I also think that ultimately this was the best decision they could have made. Because of this age fudging, we've now got a Hill boy who is the same age Bobby was in the original series, and given that this show has always been about the friction between generations within the Hill family, a 13-year-old GH gives them a lot more opportunity for storytelling and conflict. And this first episode focusing on him is a perfect example of why that works so well. Now, I don't think the episode itself is perfect. I think the resolution could have actually been handled a bit more effectively, but despite this, it's still a favorite of the season for me for a lot of reasons. Though, it is obviously an episode that's definitely going to be derided by a certain subsect of the fandom. But what works so well about this episode is that it focuses on Hank and Good Hank's relationship through echoes of their father Cotton. The episode opens with Hank and his two half-brothers, Good Hank and Junichiro, meeting a lawyer about a class action lawsuit over Cotton's shin jelly. Honestly, just a really funny premise right there in the beginning. But the most important thing that this opening shows is the disconnect between Hank and Good Hank, as well as the disrespect that GH clearly feels towards his older brother, laughing at just about anything at bad Hank's expense.
I told Cotton it was a complete waste of money, and then he told me I was a complete waste of money.
But just as importantly, this episode also establishes that GH doesn't show much respect towards his mother, completely ignoring just about any question she asks.
GH, did you hear your mother ask you a question?
Because of this, Dee Dee is really at the end of her rope, which isn't surprising. It appears as though she's no longer with her second husband and is raising GH as a single mom, and she more or less begs Hank to help. Hank's response here kind of breaks my heart, though it does make for a better story, of course. But it's kind of sad to see that Hank largely wants nothing to do with GH, even after years away, and that we can also presume he's never really had any real relationship with him. Though, Hank is also obviously averse to dealing with teenagers in general. But as far as his brotherly relationships go, this bums me out. Very fittingly, Peggy talks some sense into Hank. I've talked a lot about how Peggy maybe didn't get enough solo focus this season, but she did get so many important supporting moments like this, even when small. GH ends up staying with them for the summer, and this transitions into the meat of the plot here. GH spends his time in his room watching videos online, and we see that he's basically fallen down the manosphere rabbit hole.
I'm looking into personal development opportunities.
Okay, well, let's see then.
Now, of course, on its face, Hank loves everything this has to say. It speaks to so many of his old world sensibilities, and to him, seems like a genuinely positive opportunity for GH to grow up a little bit. Hank offers to be his mentor and even pays for the course. Now, obviously, this is a play on a lot of the stuff you see these days in the quote-unquote manosphere. This guy bears a vague resemblance to Andrew Tate. There's an overt finance bro fraternity vibe. I mean, it's all about the 5 F-bombs. So we know, while on its face, it purports to represent a lot of the things that are important to Hank, like family, faith, fiscal responsibility, etc. But anyone familiar knows that they also peddle some pretty transgressive views, particularly when it comes to women. And so, though Hank believes he's doing something helpful for GH here, ultimately, he's actually helping facilitate some potentially terrible behavior. And this is why this episode is actually an incredible spiritual successor to Season 1's classic Shins of the Father. In Shins of the Father, Hank's father Cotton comes for Bobby's birthday and basically overstays his welcome, creating excuse after excuse for why he can't leave. Despite his bad relationship with his father, Hank desperately craves Cotton's approval.
Did you win World War II? This ribeye is for my daddy.
And for Bobby, Cotton is the life of the party, showing up on a horse, gifting him a shotgun, all kinds of stuff a kid would think is great.
He didn't ruin it, he made it fun.
But of course, the person who gets the real brunt of Cotton's bad behavior is Peggy. Cotton is a clear-cut misogynist who belittles women at best and assaults them at worst. He won't even call Peggy by her first name, she's just Hank's wife. And so the entire episode's dilemma is that Hank's desperate seeking of Cotton's approval, combined with Bobby's affection for Cotton, allows for Cotton's terrible behavior to rub off onto Bobby. Thinking that time with his grandfather would be good for him means that Hank facilitates a situation where Bobby learns incredibly harmful and messed up behavior. And on top of this, Peggy is the one person who sees what is happening and is ignored at every turn.
You just cannot see your father for who he is.
Well, Bobby and I both want him to stay. So that means you're outvoted.
Not just ignored, but undermined by her father-in-law. The episode is effectively about misogyny, particularly the old world brand that Cotton exemplifies.
Take off them pink gloves. That's woman's work.
The episode is just caked with these kinds of platitudes from Cotton, unambiguously placing men above women in every context, even when Luann diagnoses what's wrong with his car very quickly and efficiently.
A woman fixing a car. That's like a pig trying to read.
Pig?
Yeah.
Obviously, this is made even worse in context by the fact that Hank's desperate approval seeking reaffirms Cotton's behavior. So you can see that the setup of No Hank Left Behind and Shins of the Father are pretty parallel, even in small ways. Cotton stays at the hills, GH stays at the hills, and in both, Hank enables or facilitates a situation in which a 13-year-old hill boy is inundated with some pretty harmful ideology. Plus, both involve Bobby and GH disrespecting their mother's authority, and maybe fittingly, the B story in No Hank Left Behind is all about Bobby and Peggy finding the right rhythm to their relationship as adults. So before we dive back into the meat of the episode, let's detour over to that B story. We've talked a lot about how Bobby's career has made him a bit of a workaholic, and this episode showcases how that causes his familial relationships to occasionally hit the back burner.
Love you, miss you. He hung up.
Bobby was supposed to play pickleball with Peggy today, but because of some unexpected work events, he couldn't make it, and of course forgot to tell her. And not only does this make Peggy a bit insecure about her relationship with Bobby, especially after Nancy and Min brag about their connections to their kids, but also playing solo causes Peggy to fully injure her knee. And in order to see the proper doctor, she's got to go to Dallas, and she needs Bobby's help. But of course, with Bobby's busy schedule, his mom is once again not the priority. He helps her to the hospital, but says that he was going to have Joseph take her all the way back to Arlen.
Yeah, he wouldn't mind. He wants to see his mom anyway.
Man, that is cold, Bobby. A real lack of self-awareness. Honestly, there's a lot I love about this story for Peggy. Obviously, it's a bit heartbreaking. Bobby has always had a good relationship with his mom, despite her Peggy-isms, and so to see him be so busy that he can't even be bothered to support her through a serious injury, it's a bummer. But Peggy also shows a lot of growth and restraint here, I'd say. It has to hurt to feel like your relationship with your son is dwindling or suffering. Then you add in direct comparisons to your friend's relationship to their kids, and have your son fully reaffirm both those feelings and comparisons in the same breath. Ouch. And yes, obviously Bobby was blindsided by this event being 1 week earlier than he expected. A big part of getting older and having responsibilities is the unfortunate reality that sometimes those responsibilities interfere with your friendships or relationships. So it's a great idea to explore here for a young adult Bobby, but this is a scenario where Bobby also has to learn how to balance these things. At the very least, despite his stress over work, he needs to find a way to reassure his mom that he cares and that he's there for her. And ultimately, this episode did a really great job getting Bobby to exactly that place. After she has a panic attack in the MRI, Peggy has to stay at Bobby's so she can do it again the next day, and while at his place, she makes a real effort to get on Bobby's level through pencil fighting. I don't know, I just found all of this to be incredibly charming. Peggy having clear-cut skills at a silly schoolhouse game and fully impressing her son and Joseph with it, it's really cute, and shows that with a little effort, that mother-son time can be so rewarding. But what I really loved was this moment moment where Bobby realized that he had been slacking in supporting his mom, looking at his phone while cooking and seeing all of her unanswered text messages, and recognizing that she wasn't having the same panic attack issues while he was around, leading to him taking the time out of his busy schedule to really be there for his mom as she does her MRI, but disguising it as telling her about this new plan for the restaurant.
Mother-son lunches every Tuesday with a themed menu inspired by your cooking. Would you want to come up once a week and check it out?
I love that Bobby's resolution here is more than just showing up. He puts forth a solution that will give him an opportunity to spend time with his mom once a week, really acknowledging the insecurity that Peggy was feeling about their relationship and finding a way to regularly be there for her. This scene also has another super specific callback to the episode Bobby Goes Nuts.
Like she was kicked by a 12-year-old some time ago.
You can tell it was a 12-year-old?
Now, I know everyone loves these callbacks, and Bobby's response here is very funny, but this is another example of those OG references feeling a tiny bit too cute to me, a little sweaty getting there. But again, I mostly forgive them because I laughed. Honestly, this is probably the best Peggy story in the entire season, which is kind of a shame since it sort of gets overshadowed by the A story. But I think pairing a heartwarming Bobby/Peggy mother and son story with good Hank's plight here, as he falls down the wrong path in terms of his respect for women and his own mother, makes them pretty complementary. Okay, let's dive back into Hank and GH's story and how it relates back to Cotton. I like that throughout the man-made boot camp, they show that Hank slowly becomes uneasy with how it's unfolding. Even in the beginning, when Eli starts pushing around this guy as part of the skit, you see that Hank is not about that. He's clearly uncomfortable while GH cheers it on and thinks the bullying is cool, but Hank comes around when the skit becomes about helping this guy out, camaraderie, brotherhood, etc. And that's sort of exactly how these systems operate. They prey on the people who feel ostracized by creating a fraternity around them, and then inundate them with harmful ideas, often blaming others, particularly women, for their problems. And you can see exactly how they band the guys together in this boot camp, initially putting them through a rigorous and difficult fitness challenge, requiring camaraderie that brings the gang closer together. And admittedly, while it's all a part of the grift, this part does work really well, and it was actually so great to see GH and Hank connect here.
I'm so glad we're here.
But the program obviously slowly introduces the things that Hank would not agree with in this modern hustle culture, the entrepreneur bro type attitudes.
I worked for Buck Strickland of Strickland Propane for nearly 30 years, and trust me, Buck was no beta.
And where a lot of this program really starts to lose Hank, and where we see a lot of the parallels to Shins of the Father, is of course in how they treat women. During this sharing circle, these men express real and justified insecurities, and every time they express those things, Eli pushes the blame onto women. Guy thinks he's too short, blames the women on Bumble. Guy feels financially inadequate, Eli blames his ex-wife who had an issue with the money he made.
And who doesn't get your jokes? Everyone? And who is slightly more than half of everyone? Females!
Now obviously these are generalized issues, but the point here is that there is no introspection. This is not self-improvement or personal development as they put it, it's pinning the blame elsewhere while refusing to acknowledge where you can actually change your own behavior for the better. And a refusal to acknowledge or change behavior is very Cotton, particularly when the world around him changed so much. Shins of the Father showcases his old school misogyny very blatantly across the episode.
You will never know if you are attractive. It's up to a man to tell you that. Hey, Missy, how about some sandwiches? See, Bobby? Woman works, man loses his sausage.
Both Cotton and Eli's worldviews are focused on placing men above women, though obviously manifesting in slightly different ways. Cotton is just an overt and vocal misogynist, while Eli caters to men's insecurities and pins the blame for those insecurities on women. And this tendency to blame quote-unquote females for all of these issues is how misogyny has rebranded and repackaged itself from Cotton's days. And so it's pretty fitting that we see Cotton's son being inundated with these views through this online role model. And if you haven't noticed, both No Hank Left Behind and Shins of the Father are largely about role models. In GH's instance, he doesn't have a strong father figure in his life, and so he's attached to these kinds of online spheres and programs to fill that void. For Bobby, he looked up to a fun grandfather who really inserted himself into his life, and in both instances, the one who could have put their foot down and fill that void was Hank. He should have been willing to step between Bobby and Cotton when Bobby was a kid, and Hank's reluctance to have any relationship with his his fatherless younger brother allowed GH to fall into that harmful rabbit hole himself. And in both instances, Hank learns he needs to step up for the sake of his son and brother. GH eventually reveals that a girl he likes friend-zoned him before he could ask her out. And while the rest of the group cries foul, Hank points out how messed up it is to feel this degree of entitlement.
She was leading me on. Eli's right. Females are the problem.
If she just wants to be your friend, that's her choice, and you need to respect her decision.
I think this was a really well-calculated modern issue to have Hank combat. Hank grew up seeing how awful and entitled his father was towards his mother and later Dee Dee, and it clearly colored how he approached his own relationship. And Peggy is somebody he has mostly always treated with respect, somebody he has seen as a friend in addition to a wife. In fact, his lesson to Bobby at the end of Shins of the Father perfectly exemplifies this.
Peggy's my best friend, son. And when you're older, I hope you're lucky enough to find a girl to be best friends with, too.
But I think the smartest thing No Hank Left Behind does here is that this message doesn't get through to GH initially because of that fraternity that Eli has built around these harmful beliefs. It shows how these systems operate. That support structure is built to reaffirm these attitudes. GH's feelings about the matter are being backed up by Eli and everyone else in the circle, so why would he back down if everyone else is supporting him? Which leads to him lashing out at Hank.
You ain't my daddy. You're just a weak sissy with a fat neck.
A stupid soy boy!
Watching this episode for the first time, I was a little unsure about the show tackling something that felt so modern, but this sequence is where it really sold me as a smart and worthwhile story to tell. Obviously, I've been talking about it throughout this entire video, but that direct comparison from Cotton's attitude and relationship with Hank to GH's attitude that's been encouraged by Eli was such a smart way to approach this kind of a modern subject. And some of Cotton's berating in this flashback echo Shins of the Father once again.
Well, that's 'cause you're weak. I blame your mama.
The resolution of Shins of the Father remains an all-timer. The episode was all about Hank's inability to stand up to his father and his refusal to back up his wife and protect her from Cotton's attacks, as well as how his lack of spine was causing Bobby to emulate his grandfather's awful behavior. And so by growing that spine, in one fell swoop, Hank solves all of these issues at once, truly standing up to his father and protecting his family.
No wonder Mom left you. She was a strong lady, classy and smart like Peg. Maybe you couldn't handle that, but I can. My marriage is a partnership of equals.
Hank then has a great heart-to-heart with Bobby in the car, where he tells him to forget everything he learned from Cotton and teaches him an important lesson that, of course, later echoes across No Hank Left Behind as well.
Women were not put on this earth to serve you and me.
Now, to be fair, this lesson is slightly undercut by the gag afterwards, where we see that they're at a drive-in restaurant being served by women. But despite this joke, that is still the lesson of this episode and what Hank is rightfully imparting onto Bobby. And so this episode sticks its landing by tying every loose end up into Hank's confrontation with Cotton. And while I really love a lot about No Hank Left Behind, I do think that it unfortunately doesn't quite stick the landing in the same way that Shins of the Father manages to. The thing is that there's a bit of a deus ex machina here, or deus ex mamina. Hank has Dale look into Eli and reveals that his mother actually owns his company, and this leads to her showing up and the guys losing respect for his hustle since it was built on a lie. I think my big problem with this ending is that I feel like this reveal is a little bit of a cop-out. Yes, it's funny and it ties to the themes of maternal respect in both this episode and Shins of the Father, but I think what bums me out is that it actually doesn't do a ton to properly dismantle the harmful ideology that the program is peddling. It sort of just gives everyone an excuse to stop respecting Eli within the narrative, but that doesn't translate to the actual harm that we see from the manosphere. I would have much rather seen the ideology be properly taken down a peg, showcase how what they're learning actually doesn't translate to the goals they're aiming for. They do obviously approach the individual issues the guys are facing in the circle a bit after the Eli's mom reveal, but it's through discussion, not in practice. Shins of the Father, on the other hand, showcases exactly how Cotton's attitude and behavior is treated in the real world, from both Cotton and from Bobby when he's emulating his grandfather.
Bobby was sent home from school for starting a sexist riot today.
What?
I do like Hank's message to the group here about respecting the women in their lives, and I like that it's effectively Hank filling the fatherly void in GH's life, becoming a new role model, but it doesn't quite all come together as seamlessly as the confrontation in Shins of the Father, since that also included the important development of Hank finally standing up to his father. But I do think it still works.
We should do something nice for our bitches.
Yeah, I think we have a little more work to do.
And it's the final emotional beats showing how GH has grown that really end the episode on an incredibly strong note. He addresses his mom respectfully, gives her a big hug, and expresses excitement about seeing his big bro again, even giving Hank a proper handshake instead of a fist bump. And I particularly love that Hank got GH this junker car for them to work on together. Hank didn't just spend some time with GH as a one-off and feel like he fulfilled his duty. He grew by building in the time and an ongoing project for them to work on together, giving him the chance to really fill in as a role model for his younger brother. And I think what I love most is the way this line from Shins of the Father, as Hank stood up to Cotton, once again echoes so well across time. Initially he was talking about Bobby, but this line works equally well for Hank and GH.
And I won't let him grow up to be a woman-hating old fool.
And Hank's newfound relationship with his brother also sticks it to Cotton one last time.
I gotta stay alive so Good Hank doesn't come out as terrible as you did.
Too bad, old man.
Man, this season truly just excelled at these genuine and sentimental moments. It's probably my favorite thing about season 14. No Hank Left Behind is not a perfect episode, but it is a really great one. I definitely wish that the resolution had done a little bit more to challenge the actual ideologies that this episode was grappling with, instead of finding a semi-convenient explanation for why the ideology peddler flounders. I think the real-world peddlers of these ideologies aren't as easily dismantled or dismissed, and so it doesn't do as much as it could have to meaningfully convince people who actually subscribe to these ideas that they're wrong. But the core of this episode is about Hank, Good Hank, and the shadow that Cotton casts over them. It's a great story that showcases how views like Cotton's can rebrand themselves in modern times, and using the son that Cotton never really got to raise as the one adopting those viewpoints was a really smart move. Not to mention the ways it paralleled one of the best episodes in season 1, it just made it all feel a lot stronger. It also did a great job pairing a story where GH needs to learn to respect his mother more with a great mother-son story in the Bobby and Peggy subplot. But for me, as a longtime fan of the show, it was mostly just unbelievably gratifying to see Hank actually forge a connection with his younger brother. I felt like Good Hank was criminally underused in the original show, even if he was just a baby. But I would have loved to see more stories centered around the two Hanks. So for this episode to not just acknowledge that Hank has had zero relationship with Good Hank, but basically take the first steps to rectify that was just so great to see. And it leaves me very hopeful that this will not just be a one-off, that Good Hank might be a recurring character throughout however long this revival continues for, and that we'll get to see not just his relationship with his older brother grow and evolve, but also how he connects with his nephew Bobby and the rest of the Hills. And that is all I've got for season 14, episode 9, No Hank Left Behind. At last, King of the Hill's 10th and final episode of their first revival season, titled A Sounder Investment. And while this isn't one of my favorites of the season, it is another very strong episode with a lot to love. Not only does this give us a pretty great conflict for post-retirement Hank and Peggy Hill, but it brings back an all-time fan favorite character that fans have been clamoring for, and gives us the first real steps into Bobby and Connie's adult romantic relationship. There is a ton to go over in this season finale, so let's dive into season 14, episode 10, A Sounder Investment. Alright, so as far as season finales go, I think this one did a pretty decent job, mostly because it felt like a really great wrap up to the more serialized Bobby aspects of the season. As for the A story, it was definitely an episode I enjoyed with some very sweet moments, but it also didn't feel like it held much more weight than any other episode this year, and I know that's actually more or less par for the course when it comes to King of the Hill season finales, outside of the classic two-part cliffhang finales like Propane Boom or As Old as the Hills, so maybe this was just the exact right route to go. The bulk of this episode is about Hank and Peggy determining where to invest the little extra money they've got in their retirement, with Hank being pretty predictably conservative in his investment philosophy, whereas Peggy wants to have a bit more say in where they're putting their money.
Every second we do not invest is money lost. Remember, time is money.
But also remember, slow and steady wins the race.
This feels very in character for both Hank and Peggy. Hank in general has very low risk tolerance, and Peggy, well, definitely does not. But I also think this feeds into Peggy's post-retirement emotions as well, as she's trying to find more successes to occupy this next stage of her life. But I think the way they ramp into the conflict here is really well paced. John Redcorn comes over to show the gang his new product, John Redcorn's Red Corn, which everybody loves, but he also seeks help in getting rid of wild hogs on his land, Hank suggests trapping them while the rest of the gang wants to shoot them. And after the hog killing success and fun they had, Boomhauer suggests turning it into a full-on business. This is where the conflict between Hank and Peggy kicks in. For one, Hank feels a little spurned by his friends who sort of made fun of him for the hog trapping attempts, and two, Peggy wants a new project to invest in with their retirement money and sees this as a great possibility to make some money and help out some friends. Even after asking their advisor at the bank if it's something worth investing in, he not only suggests that it absolutely is, but that he'd like to invest as well. So just every step of the way, Hank's instincts are being challenged, and he very stubbornly continues to sit this one out. I love that Hank's conflict here is born of FOMO. He's done the Hank Hill thing this entire episode and fully stuck with his gut, but when he sees those around him getting excited and getting perks and equipment sponsors before Born No More even launches, it just really starts to get to him. And I mean, that fully absolutely tracks. This entire conundrum is like a picture-perfect example of the Squidward in the window meme.
I just don't understand. Y'all haven't killed Pig 1 yet.
I think this is a pretty interesting look into Hank's tendencies here. He's singular in that he's the only one who doesn't think this is a good business idea, but he desperately needs someone else to validate those feelings, which is understandable given that his wife and best friends are all on board. Usually Hank is pretty steadfast in his beliefs, but the way that FOMO creeps in forces him to seek that validation elsewhere.
I'm gonna run it past the most successful business person I know.
Enter Buck Strickland. Welcome back, Buck. Honestly, I really thought he would have died by now, so it was nice to see the old man make a return, particularly given that it's one of Stephen Root's best performances. Now, I will say, Buck's return does still leave a lot of questions unanswered. I think a lot of fans have wondered how and why Hank left Strickland Propane for his job at Aramco, and the only real concrete info we get about Strickland is this.
I'm retired, Hank. I got nothing but time now.
I definitely wonder if we'll get explicit explanations for how and why his time at Strickland came to an end, but I feel like a relatively fair assumption is just that Buck decided to retire and close down Strickland Propane in the process. Maybe there's more to it, maybe we'll get some flashbacks and see the actual scenario that led to Hank moving to Saudi Arabia, but my gut tells me that if Strickland was still an option, Hank would never have left, and then that the possibility of earning their retirement nest egg made sense for them to go to the Aramco base after Strickland closed down, which honestly is a very good thing because Hank deserved better treatment from Buck, and honestly he still does.
How much is the buy-in?
That's the same amount as you used to pay me in a year.
Well, that's nothing.
Basically, Buck straight up tells Hank not to invest in Born No More, and then Buck fully buys the final available shares and takes Hank's place. Brutal and kinda classic Buck. Even in his mid-70s, he's just absolutely selfish and screwing Hank over. I love the way this continually ramps up the reasons Hank would feel this intense FOMO. His friends, family, and former boss/business role model all getting in on it while he sits it out, plus the perks and free equipment, including trucks. Oh, and Nolan Ryan is there too. Not to mention the fact that the stock is just going up, 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 and they are all making money. I really felt like this was the perfect storm to see Hank go against his gut and stubborn nature and give in to the peer pressure, buying stock far too late. It really just was a barrage of circumstances that would make him falter in his convictions. And he buys in just in time for the stock to absolutely crash out. Oof. At least it leads to one of the best bois of the season, though. But damn, did I really love this resolution, because as it turns out, Peggy sold her stock before the crash, getting out at the right time and recognizing that Hank's safer and lower risk tolerance was what convinced her it was all happening too fast.
I made the right decision because of you.
I guess we do make a good team.
I love that this doesn't frame either of them as being in the right, and that they complement each other's sensibilities. If either of them had gone all in on their initial convictions, they wouldn't have gotten much of anywhere. And the resolution being that they tag team the next decision for their investment money is really sweet, particularly given that it's to invest in John Redcorn's Red Corn. Also, genuinely kind of amazing that the final scene of the revival season included John Redcorn, given Jonathan Joss's tragic murder before the season began. I believe we'll still get his performance in season 15, but honoring him with the final scene in the final episode was fitting this year. But overall, this was a really sweet Hank and Peggy story. I think highlighting those ways they complement each other as a couple works really well, showcasing both of their strengths and weaknesses. Hank's stubborn, repressed attitude might force him to miss out on opportunity, while Peggy's gung-ho leap before you look attitude might cause her to make rash decisions. Together, they reel it into a happy medium. And I like that where the A story is about a 30-year marriage still finding the ways they fit together together like a puzzle, the B story is about the beginning of a relationship finding how they fit together as well. And this is the part of the episode I most want to talk about, the Bobby and Connie of it all. Honestly, I really love that this was an ongoing development over the course of the entire season. Obviously, King of the Hill has always had slight serialized elements throughout, but this felt like a really effective through line that anchored the revival. After the events of conscious uncoupling where Connie and Shane broke up, Bobby and Connie are now going on their first date as adults. And that is a slightly awkward circumstance. Obviously, they have all of this history and familiarity, but they both lived so much life since then. And that's really what this entire B story is about. Bobby schedules their first date to be at this fancy violin concerto because he knows Connie loved violin, only to learn,
"You don't play violin anymore?"
I don't.
This was such a smart way to approach Bobby and Connie's attempts to date again. Such a natural conflict for them to work through together. In a lot of ways, Connie and Bobby picked up right where they left off because they still have natural chemistry. But they have so much to learn about how they've grown over the years and how their lives have changed. They sort of both realized that they've got a workaholic tendency going on, so there's a little bit of commonality there. For Connie, it's pulling all-nighters for school. For Bobby, it's because he's basically solo running Robota Chain and has to stay up late doing a lot of the grunt work, which pretty comically leads to them both falling asleep during this ultra-long concerto, a funny, blunderous first date. Honestly though, despite this being sort of a bad date, it's an adorable story. If they do end up together long-term, it's a great first date story to tell. But they both recognize that this was sort of a dud and try to approach the second date differently.
We just need to figure out a good us date, you know?
I like this idea too because it's once again a supernatural mistake for them to make. They're chasing the relationship they used to have instead of learning what they're meant to be now and moving forward. Connie chooses a trampoline park, seemingly because it reminded her of when Bill had the Christmas-themed bounce house in season 5's 'Twas the Nut Before Christmas. Crazy title, by the way. But that was also the episode where they both got drunk for the first time, so there's some mixed feelings there.
Remember the creepy guy who sold us beer? And I remember throwing up.
Though I will say, with that episode being referenced, given where we're at right now in the show, this is sort of a cute line to look back on.
Just think, Connie girl, when we're grown-ups and marrieds, we'll get to do this every night.
Connie pretty quickly dislocates her shoulder and they have to go to the hospital. And I love that this still shows that Bobby is very proactive and helpful in this situation, knowing Connie's allergies, blood type, and immediately having that info for the doctors. It proves he'd be a caring and thoughtful boyfriend, but this is also where Bobby starts to realize that they really still might be living in the past in terms of what they know about each other.
What if all our connections now are just memories of the connection we had when we were younger?
Honestly, I'm so grateful that the show didn't put Connie and Bobby together immediately when the revival began, and also that they didn't make this a particularly simple reunion. It's nice to know that they're essentially going to be learning about the adult versions of each other as they continue to date, and aren't just some meant-to-be couple because they dated when they were kids, which does kind of seem like what a lot of the fandom wanted, which bothers me a bit considering King of the Hill's dedication to realistic character dynamics and relationships. But this final sequence is sweet despite Connie being hilariously drugged up, but her lack of inhibitions cause her to blurt out this incredibly honest admiration she has about Bobby as an adult.
You're the bravest person I know because you knew exactly what you wanted to do and you are doing it.
I really loved the detail that this final thing we see them geeking out about are related but not identical. They're both talking about cool things happening in South Korea, but Connie is talking about quantum dot emitters and Bobby is talking about kimchi, leading them to being interested in traveling there. To me, that's always been an important formula in a relationship, having overlap in interests but not one-to-one interests, things you can share with your partner and vice versa, and subsequently share in each other's excitement through their eyes. I really do think that this through line with Bobby and Connie was my favorite aspect of the revival. It felt so naturally paced, and even as someone who basically went on record saying I didn't really want them to be together in the revival, the fact that they built to it instead of introducing it as a given or expectation made it really work for me. And that is all I've got for King of the Hill Season 14, Episode 10, A Sounder Investment, but let me work through some of my feelings on the season as a whole before we go. I know I've echoed these sentiments across all of my coverage for Season 14 of King of the Hill, but I just cannot express how much I adored this revival. I feel like King of the Hill was the show that would be the easiest to absolutely mess up in an attempted return, and somehow, even with plenty of new writers on the staff, they just so beautifully captured the spirit of the original series. It's been so cool to not only be surprised and captivated disappointed by the revival, but to see that the majority of fans agree that it is of impeccable quality. I think the most important thing here is that the show understood the assignment when it came to the characters. Nobody felt out of place, nobody felt like they had been flanderized, everybody felt like the characters I loved and remembered. They didn't overly rely on finger pointing at modern trends, they naturally introduced those modern trends to these familiar characters and the stories bloomed from there. And they adjusted pretty seamlessly to fit the modern TV landscape. Even with just 10 episodes, they managed to deliver 10 distinct episodic stories that also delivered a satisfying ongoing through line for Bobby, adapting slightly into the serialized age without betraying the core of the show. I do think that the new season seemed to avoid leaning into explanations and backstory for how or why things have changed, to slightly mixed results. They give pretty minimal explanation for the new status quo. We don't see how Hank left for Saudi Arabia or what it took for Bobby and Chain to partner up when starting Robota Chain, and I think that largely worked to its benefit. It allowed us to focus on where the characters are now, not where they've been, but I do think there are some notable places where this didn't serve them. The fact that Luann and Lucky were not even mentioned a single time really stood out to me. Obviously, there is a portrait of them in the Hill House, but I was expecting that we'd get at least some insight into how or why they left and where they are now. Though given some of the buzz from the writers in interviews, I expect that we'll get a definitive answer at some point in season 15. They seem to imply that they were written out pretty specifically, though if I am being honest, I really felt the hole in the show where Luann used to be. She remains one of my absolute favorite characters, and while I'm less attached to Lucky, I really missed Luann in season 14. And though I do fully understand the inclination to retire the characters in honor of Brittany Murphy and Tom Petty, given that the show has now recast so many of its characters and might need to recast John Redcorn for a second time, I think I'd almost prefer if they just recast Luann. It hurts me a little bit to say because Brittany Murphy was and is a legend in this role, but I just really love to see how Luann has grown, where she and Lucky are, how Gracie has been raised, what their relationship to Hank, Peggy, and Bobby is at this point in their lives. I think those things are worth a little bit more to me at this point than hanging the characters' jerseys in the rafters. At the very least, I hope we maybe get Gracie in for an episode in season 15. It would be at least a serviceable way to get a window into Luann and Lucky's lives post-finale. But with how strong these episodes are, I honestly have no problem saying that I'd love to see this series continue as long as they want to write it. And with how successful it was, it's hard to imagine that won't happen. It was just an unequivocal smash success both critically and especially in ratings. As of writing this, we have no confirmation that the show has been renewed beyond next year's 10 episodes, but I would be absolutely shocked if it didn't happen. Genuinely flabbergasted. And that's it. So folks, thank you so much for sticking with me covering the newest season of King of the Hill, even though it took me forever to get these last 2 breakdowns done. But what a great season it was. If you enjoyed them, please stay tuned. I will be covering classic King of the Hill episodes periodically, and of course I'm going to dive headfirst into season 15 the moment it's available next summer. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you soon. Peace.
I stay mellow watching Johnny Two Cellos. He talks cartoons, he's a really cool fellow. He keeps you posted on adult cartoons. If that's what you're into, then grab a spoon and a very big bowl of your favorite cereal. Feels like Saturday morning cartoon material. Johnny Two Cellos, watch him on YouTube. Now enjoy this groove and bust a move.